Hello my friend and welcome. Before we settle into tonight's journey, I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Leave me a comment with your country and your local time. I always enjoy seeing how many different corners of the world gather together for these quiet history evenings. And if you enjoy slow, relaxing historical storytelling, consider liking the video and subscribing, so you won't miss our next adventure through the forgotten pages of the past. Make yourself comfortable. Perhaps there's a warm blanket nearby. Maybe the room is already dim. As you listen, allow the modern world to fade gently into the distance. Tonight, we're sailing toward one of the most astonishing survival stories in British naval history. It begins with an ambitious naval expedition. It ends with shipwreck, starvation, mutiny, impossible choices, and a courtroom where every survivor tells a different version of the same nightmare. Some men returned home as heroes, others returned as criminals, and some never returned at all. The truth was scattered across thousands of miles of empty ocean. So let us travel back. The year is 1740. Britain and Spain are once again at war. Across Europe, political alliances shifted almost as quickly as the winds that filled the sails of great wooden warships. Kings argued over colonies. Merchants argued over trade. Admirals argued over strategy. Ordinary sailors rarely argued about any of it. They simply climbed aboard whichever vessel the Royal Navy assigned them, and hoped fortune would prove kinder than experience suggested. The conflict historians now remember as part of the War of Jenkins' Ear had already drawn thousands of sailors across the Atlantic Ocean. Britain's government hoped to weaken Spanish power in South America by attacking ports along the Pacific coast. It sounded straightforward when discussed in London. On a map spread across a polished table, the oceans seemed manageable. Routes looked like neat blue lines. Distances appeared reasonable. Supplies could always be replenished, someone assumed. Reality at sea was very different. The Pacific coast of South America could only be reached by rounding Cape Horn. Even today, Cape Horn commands enormous respect among sailors. In the 18th century, it inspired something closer to fear. Towering waves arrived without warning. Hurricane-force winds screamed across freezing waters. Currents collided from different oceans. Ice floated south. Visibility disappeared inside thick fog. Wooden ships creaked under stresses their builders had never imagined. Yet this was exactly where Britain's naval commanders intended to send an entire squadron. Leading the expedition was Commodore George Anson. Anson was experienced, respected, and trusted by the Admiralty. His mission combined military objectives with economic ones. He would disrupt Spanish shipping, capture valuable treasure if possible, and demonstrate British naval strength in waters where Spain believed itself secure. The expedition consisted of several ships. Among them sailed HMS Voyage. Unlike Anson's flagship, Voyage had begun life as an East Indiaman, a merchant vessel designed for the long commercial voyages between Britain and Asia. Built for carrying cargo rather than engaging enemies, she had later been purchased by the Royal Navy and converted into a warship. Her transformation was impressive. Heavy guns replaced merchant accommodations. Military discipline replaced commercial routine. But beneath those changes remained the hull originally intended for very different work. No one yet knew how severely that hull would soon be tested. The men aboard represented almost every corner of British society. Some were experienced professional sailors. Some had spent years crossing oceans aboard merchant ships. Others had been pressed into naval service against their will. Press gangs regularly roamed British ports, empowered by law to seize men considered suitable for naval duty. A walk along the waterfront could unexpectedly become the beginning of years at sea. Many young men never planned to join the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy planned for them. Life aboard an 18th century warship demanded constant labor. Every sail required attention. Every rope needed maintenance. Every cannon demanded careful cleaning. Water barrels leaked. Food spoiled. Wood expanded and shrank with changing weather. Nothing stayed finished for long. The work never truly ended. Sleep came in short intervals. The sea respected no schedules. Storms often arrived during the darkest hours of the night, sending exhausted sailors scrambling up slippery rigging hundreds of feet above freezing water. Meals reflected the practical limits of long-distance sailing. Salted beef, salted pork, ship's biscuit so hard it sometimes required soaking before anyone could bite into it comfortably. Dried peas, milk, cheese when available. Fresh food disappeared quickly after departure. As weeks turned into months, scurvy became an increasingly dangerous enemy. Today we understand vitamin C. In 1740, its importance remained unknown. Sailors only recognized the terrifying symptoms: swollen gums, loose teeth, painful joints, extreme weakness, old wounds reopening, healthy young men slowly becoming unable to climb ladders. Disease often killed more sailors than enemy cannon. The squadron departed Britain in September 1740 with optimism that felt entirely reasonable at the time. Families watched from crowded harbors. Flags waved. Church bells rang. Officers reviewed orders. Sails caught favorable winds. Ships gradually disappeared beyond the horizon. Many watching believed the expedition would return with glorious victories. History had different plans. Crossing the Atlantic presented familiar hardships but nothing beyond ordinary expectations. The true challenge still waited thousands of miles ahead. As the squadron approached South America, weather gradually worsened. The air cooled. Clouds thickened. The sea became restless. Experienced sailors recognized warning signs almost instinctively. Cape Horn was approaching. There are few places on Earth where nature displays such relentless power. The Southern Ocean circles the globe almost without interruption from land. Powerful winds travel enormous distances, gathering strength across open water. By the time those winds strike ships near Cape Horn, they possess astonishing force. Gigantic waves rise like moving hills. Entire valleys seem to open between them. A ship may climb skyward one moment and plunge downward the next. Timbers groan. Masts bend. Rigging snaps. Every surface becomes slippery. Even breathing can feel difficult beneath freezing spray. For weeks, the British squadron battled conditions that seemed determined to destroy them. Storm followed storm. Navigation became nearly impossible. Cloud cover often hid both sun and stars. Without reliable celestial observations, determining precise position grew increasingly uncertain. Ships that had sailed together gradually lost sight of one another. Communication vanished. Each captain suddenly faced the Southern Ocean alone. The expedition that had departed Britain as a coordinated naval force slowly dissolved into scattered vessels separated by weather beyond human control. Among them drifted HMS Voyage. Her officers still believed they could find the Commodore again. They still believed the mission remained possible. They still believed the worst might soon pass. None of them knew they were sailing toward one of the most extraordinary disasters in the history of the Royal Navy. The next storm would not simply test their courage. It would begin to unravel discipline, loyalty, command, and even the meaning of survival itself. The winds refused to settle. Day after day, HMS Voyage fought the Southern Ocean, and every mile gained seemed to disappear beneath another storm. The crew had long stopped expecting comfort. Dry clothing was a distant memory. Nearly every blanket carried the smell of seawater. The wooden decks remained slick, while the rigging dripped constantly with icy spray that froze hands almost as quickly as it touched them. For sailors in the 18th century, storms were not unusual. Every experienced seaman expected rough weather from time to time. What made Cape Horn different was its persistence. The ocean offered no pause. One gale ended only for another to begin. The ship rolled so violently that even eating became difficult. A simple meal of salted beef and biscuit might end with the food sliding across the table before anyone managed a single bite. Barrels shifted despite careful securing. Heavy guns, each weighing thousands of pounds, had to be lashed firmly in place. If one broke free during a violent roll, it could smash through men, walls, and equipment with terrifying force. The officers struggled to maintain routine. Routine was essential aboard every Royal Navy vessel. Bells marked the watches. Men rotated through duties. Sails were adjusted according to wind direction. Equipment received constant inspection. Even during terrible weather, discipline created order. But nature cared little for naval regulations. One exhausted sailor replaced another at the helm. The wheel demanded enormous strength as waves continually pushed against the rudder. Sometimes several men worked together simply to keep the ship pointed into the sea. A single mistake could leave the vessel broadside to the waves, where enormous walls of water threatened to roll her completely over. Every hour seemed longer than the last. The crew had now spent months away from Britain. Many were already weakened by poor nutrition. Fresh fruit and vegetables had disappeared long ago. Scurvy quietly spread among the men. The disease moved slowly enough that many failed to notice its arrival until serious damage had already begun. A sailor who had climbed the rigging with ease weeks earlier now found himself stopping to catch his breath halfway up the shrouds. Swollen gums bled easily. Teeth loosened. Muscles ached without obvious cause. The surgeons could treat injuries from falls, cuts, or cannon accidents. Scurvy remained a mystery. No one aboard understood that something as simple as fresh citrus fruit might have changed everything. Instead, they watched healthy young men become weak without explanation. Among the officers serving aboard Voyage was Lieutenant David Cheap. Cheap had spent much of his adult life in the Royal Navy. Like many career officers, he believed deeply in naval discipline. Authority, in his view, depended upon obedience. Orders were to be carried out immediately, especially during dangerous situations where hesitation could cost lives. His strict manner earned respect from some sailors. It also earned resentment from others. Long voyages magnified every disagreement. Tiny conflicts that might have lasted only moments on land could linger for months aboard a crowded ship where there was no escape from one's companions. Every officer understood that morale mattered. So did fairness. So did food. Unfortunately, all three became increasingly scarce. The storms continued driving the scattered British squadron farther from its intended course. Navigators attempted daily calculations whenever brief breaks in the clouds allowed observations of the sun. Using sextants had not yet become common practice. Instead, they relied on earlier navigational instruments along with dead reckoning, estimating position through speed, direction, and elapsed time. Dead reckoning worked reasonably well under stable conditions. Cape Horn provided anything but stability. Powerful currents quietly carried ships away from their estimated positions. Violent winds forced repeated course changes. Clouds often prevented accurate celestial measurements for days at a time. Small errors multiplied. No captain could know precisely where he was. The charts themselves contained uncertainties. Large sections of the southern Pacific remained poorly surveyed by European navigators. Coastlines appeared incomplete. Islands were misplaced or missing altogether. Every calculation contained doubt. Meanwhile, the weather steadily damaged Voyage herself. Her masts endured enormous strain. Rigging snapped repeatedly and required dangerous repairs high above the deck. Sailmakers worked constantly, stitching torn canvas by hand before another gale shredded it once again. Below deck, leaks demanded endless pumping. Wooden ships naturally leaked. Every sailor accepted this fact. The pumps formed part of daily life. But heavy seas increased the amount of water entering the hull. Pump crews labored hour after hour. If they stopped, water accumulated. Too much water meant disaster. The endless labor exhausted everyone aboard. Sleep became fragmented. Some men remained awake for nearly an entire day during severe storms before collapsing into hammocks for only a few precious hours. Others never fully removed their clothes because emergency calls came so frequently. Every shout on deck carried urgency. "All hands!" The words echoed through the cramped compartments below. Within moments, tired sailors stumbled upward into freezing darkness. Sometimes another sail needed reefing. Sometimes a spar had broken. Sometimes a wave had swept equipment overboard. No one complained openly. Complaints changed nothing. Survival demanded action. The officers continued searching for signs of Commodore Anson's flagship. Each morning brought fresh hope. Each evening ended in disappointment. The vast southern ocean swallowed ships with remarkable ease. Even vessels only a few miles apart could disappear completely behind rain, fog, or mountainous waves. Signals became impossible. Isolation settled over HMS Voyager. The crew no longer knew whether the rest of the expedition remained intact. Perhaps Anson had already rounded Cape Horn. Perhaps another ship had sunk. Perhaps everyone else faced the same desperate struggle. No one could say. As January turned toward February 1741, conditions worsened again. A series of exceptionally violent storms struck the region. Several contemporary journals describe waves breaking completely over the decks. Men tied themselves to the rigging simply to avoid being washed into the sea. Others disappeared despite every precaution. A sailor swept overboard during such weather rarely survived more than a few moments. Launching a rescue boat was impossible. Turning the ship around was equally impossible. The sea claimed its victims without ceremony. Each loss reminded the survivors how fragile their own lives had become. Yet the greatest danger still remained unseen. The coast of southern Chile stretches for hundreds of miles through countless islands, hidden reefs, narrow channels, and rocky outcrops. Thick forests covered the land, while fog often concealed it until ships came dangerously close. European charts captured only fragments of this complicated coastline. Entire islands remained unnamed. Hazards went unrecorded. A navigator might believe open water lay ahead when solid rock waited just beyond the mist. Somewhere west of Patagonia, HMS Voyager drifted steadily toward that maze. The officers still believed they had room to maneuver. They still trusted their calculations. But the ocean had quietly pushed them much farther east than anyone realized. Land was now far closer than the crew imagined. Invisible through rain and darkness, jagged rocks waited beneath pounding surf. Within days, exhausted sailors who had survived months of storms would face an entirely different enemy. The sea that had battered them without mercy was about to throw their ship onto an unknown shore, where survival would become far more complicated than simply staying afloat. The morning brought no comfort. Gray clouds still hung low over the sea, blending almost perfectly with the restless water below. Rain drifted across the horizon in long curtains, hiding whatever lay beyond. The wind had eased only slightly, enough to fool an inexperienced sailor into believing the worst might finally be over. The veterans knew better. Cape Horn had a habit of offering brief moments of calm before unleashing another storm. Aboard HMS Voyager, nearly everyone showed signs of exhaustion. Faces had grown thinner. Beards had become long and uneven. Clothing worn almost constantly for months had stiffened with salt. Boots rarely dried. Fingers remained cracked from cold, wet ropes. The smell below deck was a mixture of damp timber, tar, smoke, sweat, and seawater, a scent every 18th century sailor knew well. The officers continued their daily routine despite the hardships. Navigation remained their greatest concern. Whenever the clouds parted, even for a few moments, the master and his assistants hurried to make observations. Every glimpse of the sun offered another chance to estimate their position. But accurate navigation depended on more than one observation. It required reliable instruments. It required clear skies. It required knowing how fast the ship had traveled between observations. The violent weather had disrupted all of that. Strong currents beneath the surface quietly carried Voyager away from the course her officers believed she was following. Winds pushed the vessel in unexpected directions. Waves forced repeated corrections at the helm. The calculations looked reasonable. Reality was something else entirely. No one aboard knew with certainty how close they had drifted toward the broken coastline of southern Chile. The charts available to British navigators showed only the broad outline of the region. Beyond that lay uncertainty. Thousands of islands stretched along the Pacific coast. Many had never been carefully surveyed by Europeans. Hidden reefs waited just beneath the surface. Sharp rocks rose suddenly from deep water. Narrow channels twisted between forested islands where powerful tides changed direction several times each day. To sailors who did not know these waters, it was one of the most dangerous coastlines on Earth. Below deck, the ship's carpenter continued inspecting the hull. Years at sea had taught him to notice every groan in the timbers. Wooden ships were living structures in many ways. Their planks expanded, shrank, twisted, and settled with changes in temperature and moisture. After months of relentless pounding, even a well-built vessel could begin to weaken. The carpenter found fresh leaks. Not large enough to cause immediate panic. Large enough to demand attention. Pump crews returned to work once again. Hour after hour they forced seawater back over the side. Every man knew the pumps. No one liked them. It was exhausting labor with no visible reward. The water never seemed to stop coming. Still the ship floated. That was enough. The crew had also begun noticing another problem. Food stores were shrinking. Before leaving England, the expedition had been supplied for a long voyage. Yet storms had delayed progress far beyond expectations. Rations had already been reduced more than once. Salted beef remained edible, though many barrels had begun to spoil. Ship's biscuit survived longer, but insects often found it first. Sailors joked darkly that extra protein came free with every meal. The jokes grew less frequent as hunger increased. Fresh drinking water demanded careful management as well. Barrels sometimes leaked. Others became contaminated. Every gallon mattered. No one knew exactly how much longer the voyage would last. The uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone aboard. Some men tried to remain optimistic. Surely they would soon reunite with Commodore Anson. Surely they would find calmer seas. Surely they would reach friendlier waters where fresh food and clean water could be obtained. Others said very little. Long voyages often taught sailors not to place too much faith in hopeful predictions. Nature rarely listened. Lieutenant David Cheap maintained strict discipline despite growing hardship. Punishments for neglecting duty remained in force. Orders continued to be expected without hesitation. From Cheap's perspective, relaxing discipline invited disaster. A warship survived because every man understood his responsibilities, especially now. Yet maintaining authority over exhausted, hungry sailors was becoming increasingly difficult. Some officers quietly disagreed with one another. Not openly. Not yet. But fatigue affected officers just as surely as common seamen. Small disagreements over navigation, sail handling, or daily decisions slowly accumulated beneath the surface. For the moment, everyone remained united by a larger goal: keep the ship afloat. Late one afternoon, visibility improved slightly. The rain eased. The sea remained rough, but distant shapes briefly appeared through the mist. Land! The cry echoed across the deck. Heads turned immediately. Some sailors climbed into the rigging for a better view. Others shaded tired eyes against the pale light. There it was, dark, jagged, covered in dense forest. For a moment, relief spread across the ship. Land often meant fresh water, fresh food, perhaps even a chance to repair damage. But relief quickly gave way to concern. The officers had not expected land to appear where it did. According to their calculations, open ocean should still have surrounded them. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Navigation books came out once again. Charts were spread across the cabin table. Measurements were reviewed. Courses compared. Arguments remained polite but urgent. Had the currents been stronger than expected? Had the dead reckoning drifted farther east? Had repeated storms carried them off course without anyone realizing the full extent? No one could answer with certainty. The coastline itself offered few clues. Its mountains disappeared into cloud. Countless islands blended together. Without recognizable landmarks, identifying their exact position proved nearly impossible. The safest decision seemed obvious. Stand farther offshore. Gain sea room. Avoid hidden rocks until their position became clearer. Orders were given. The helm responded. Sails adjusted. Yet the wind had ideas of its own. Instead of carrying Voyager safely away from the coast, shifting gusts repeatedly forced her back toward land. Currents beneath the hull continued pulling relentlessly eastward. From the deck, the shoreline appeared frustratingly close one moment, then vanished behind rain the next. Night approached. Darkness transformed uncertainty into genuine danger. Lookouts strained their eyes. Every breaking wave ahead might conceal rocks. Every shadow could mark another island. The sound of surf sometimes drifted across the water, then disappeared beneath the wind. Experienced sailors understood what that meant. Breaking surf where none should exist often signaled unseen reefs. The officers ordered constant vigilance. No one relaxed. Lanterns glowed dimly on deck. Commands passed quietly through the darkness. Every minute felt important. Then, sometime during the night, the unmistakable roar returned. Not thunder. Not wind. Surf. Closer now. Far too close. Before anyone could fully understand what lay ahead, the lookout shouted again. This time there was no uncertainty. There were breakers directly in the ship's path. The helm was thrown over immediately. Sails were handled as quickly as exhausted crews could manage. But a heavy 18th century warship could not turn instantly. Momentum carried her onward. The wind pressed against the canvas. The current pushed beneath the keel. The shoreline rushed nearer with terrifying speed. The first impact had not yet come. But every man aboard HMS Voyager suddenly understood the dreadful truth. After surviving months of the world's most dangerous ocean, they were only moments away from meeting the rocks. The darkness hid almost everything. No moon shone through the heavy clouds. Rain swept across the sea in cold sheets, while the wind carried the deep, unmistakable roar of waves crashing against unseen rocks. Every sailor aboard HMS Voyager knew that sound. It was the sound no captain ever wished to hear. Breakers ahead. The warning came again. This time it carried an urgency that cut through the howl of the wind. Officers shouted orders almost simultaneously. Hard to starboard. Haul the sails. Stand by. The crew reacted with the speed that only months of hardship could produce. Men scrambled through the darkness, climbing wet rigging with frozen hands. Others strained at ropes that had become stiff with salt and rain. Every movement demanded strength that many scarcely possessed. The ship answered slowly. Far too slowly. An 18th century warship weighed hundreds of tons. She could not spin away from danger like a small fishing boat. Even with every sailor working together, changing course required precious minutes. Minutes they no longer had. The surf grew louder. Now the crew could actually see white water exploding against black rocks ahead. The sea itself seemed to glow as enormous waves burst into foam. Another command rang across the deck. Drop the anchor. The heavy iron anchor plunged into the dark water. Its great cable raced over the bow, smoking with friction. For a brief moment everyone hoped. Perhaps the anchor would catch. Perhaps it would hold. Perhaps the ship would stop before reaching the rocks. Instead, the cable tightened with tremendous force. The entire vessel shuddered. The anchor dragged helplessly across the seabed. Nothing could stop the momentum. The ocean continued carrying HMS Voyager toward the coast. Then came the first collision. A violent crash echoed through the hull. The entire ship lurched upward before slamming back down. Men were thrown across the deck. Lanterns swung wildly. Several sailors lost their footing and crashed into guns and railings. Below deck, barrels broke loose despite their lashings. Wood splintered somewhere deep inside the ship. The sound was unlike anything most of the crew had ever heard. Not cannon fire. Not thunder. It was the sound of a ship striking solid rock. For one heartbeat, everything seemed strangely still. Then another enormous wave lifted the vessel. Instead of carrying her back into deep water, it dropped her even farther onto the reef. The second impact proved worse. Heavy timbers cracked. Water burst upward through damaged planking. Several cannons shifted violently despite being secured. One smashed into nearby equipment, crushing wood and scattering debris through the gun deck. The carpenter rushed below almost immediately. He did not need long to understand the situation. The hull had been badly breached. Water was pouring inside. The pumps began once more. But this time they accomplished almost nothing. Men worked desperately, forcing handles up and down with every remaining ounce of strength. The incoming water rose faster than they could remove it. The sea had finally found its way inside. On deck, confusion mixed with discipline. Captain David Cheap, who had assumed command after Captain Dandy Kidd's illness and death earlier in the voyage, struggled to organize the crew amid the chaos. Orders flew through the darkness. Some sailors attempted to lighten the ship by throwing heavy equipment overboard. Others secured loose spars before they became deadly projectiles. Still others tried desperately to lower boats into the violent surf. Launching a boat under such conditions bordered on impossible. One wave could smash it against the hull before anyone climbed aboard. Another could overturn it instantly. Still, preparations continued. Every possible chance of survival had to be considered. Nature offered little encouragement. The sea struck the stranded ship again and again. Each wave lifted her slightly before dropping her heavily against the rocks beneath. Every impact opened fresh leaks. Every impact weakened the hull further. The ship groaned like a living creature under unbearable strain. Some sailors later wrote that they believed the vessel would break apart before dawn. It was not an unreasonable fear. Wooden ships depended upon the strength of thousands of carefully fitted timbers. Once those connections failed, the sea completed the destruction quickly. Below deck, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Water reached the lower compartments. Loose supplies floated through the darkness. Powder had to be protected from seawater. Food stores risked being ruined. The surgeon's instruments scattered across the deck of his tiny cabin. Men stumbled through rising water while trying to save whatever could still be saved. Yet amidst the confusion, the discipline of the Royal Navy remained remarkable. There was fear. There was shouting. There was desperation. But there was no complete collapse into panic. Most sailors continued following orders. Years of naval training still guided their actions. Toward morning the weather eased slightly. Gray light slowly spread across the horizon. For the first time, the crew could clearly see where fate had brought them. The sight was astonishing. The ship rested among rocks just offshore from a wild, forested island along the coast of what is now southern Chile. Steep hills rose behind dense woodland. Towering trees covered much of the landscape. Mist drifted through the valleys. There were no towns. No farms. No visible signs of European settlement. Only wilderness. The realization settled heavily upon everyone. Even if they reached land alive, rescue might not come for months. Perhaps years. Perhaps never. The nearest known Spanish settlements lay hundreds of miles away through dangerous waters. Their own squadron had long since disappeared into the vast Pacific. No one knew where Commodore Anson might be. He certainly did not know where Wager had vanished. The tide continued rising. Each incoming wave battered the damaged hull. The carpenter delivered grim news. The ship could not be saved. She might remain standing for a few hours. She might survive another tide. No one could predict exactly when she would finally break apart. The decision became unavoidable. The crew had to abandon ship. It was one of the most dangerous operations imaginable. More than 100 exhausted men needed to reach an unfamiliar shore through pounding surf carrying whatever supplies they could manage. Every trip in the ship's boats risked disaster. Strong currents swept constantly between the rocks. Cold water numbed hands within minutes. Many sailors could not swim. In the 18th century, surprisingly few professional seamen learned. Heavy clothing made survival in rough seas even less likely. Yet remaining aboard guaranteed eventual death. One by one, preparations began. Boats were lowered whenever the surf allowed. Ropes stretched toward the shore. Essential supplies, powder, muskets, tools, food, sails for shelter, and navigation instruments, were gathered as quickly as possible. Each decision mattered. Every barrel saved today might mean another week of survival later. Every tool rescued from the wreck might become indispensable. The officers could not know it yet. The shipwreck itself would prove only the beginning of their ordeal. The wilderness waiting beyond the beach would test not only their endurance, but also their loyalty, their judgment, and eventually their willingness to obey the very officers who had commanded them at sea. Long after HMS Voyage disappeared beneath the waves, the struggle for survival would become something far more dangerous than a battle against nature alone. It would become a battle between the survivors themselves. Morning revealed the full extent of the disaster. The gray light spread slowly across the island, illuminating a coastline unlike anything most of the crew of HMS Voyage had ever seen. Jagged rocks lined the shore. Dense evergreen forests climbed steep hillsides. Low clouds drifted between the trees, and the cold air carried the constant smell of salt, wet wood, and seaweed. The island seemed untouched. No church steeple. No harbor. No smoke rising from cottages. No cultivated fields. Only wilderness stretching in every direction. For a few moments, many of the sailors simply stared. After months surrounded by nothing but ocean, solid ground should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt uncertain. The sea had nearly killed them. The land offered no promise that it would be kinder. Captain David Cheap understood that every minute mattered. The ship remained firmly stranded, but no one believed she would survive much longer. Each wave struck her weakened hull with tremendous force. Cracks widened. Planks shifted. Water continued pouring into the lower decks. The order to abandon the ship became final. There would be no returning to sea aboard HMS Voyage. The crew began transferring everything that might help them survive. Food received the highest priority. Barrels of salted beef, casks of pork, ship's biscuit, dried peas, milk, flour, anything still dry enough to eat. The work demanded extraordinary effort. Heavy barrels had to be lowered carefully into boats while waves lifted and dropped both vessels unpredictably. A single mistake could crush hands or throw men into the freezing water. Next came the weapons. Muskets, powder, swords, axes. Even stranded on an isolated island, they could not assume they would remain alone forever. The coastline belonged to the Spanish Empire, Britain's enemy. Any future encounter might quickly become dangerous. Tools followed. Hammers, nails, rope, canvas, cooking pots, fishing equipment. The carpenter insisted on saving every useful piece of iron that could be removed from the wreck. Iron was precious. Without blacksmiths nearby, every nail suddenly possessed enormous value. The surgeon also rescued what medical supplies remained. His collection was limited by modern standards. Bandages, basic surgical instruments, medicinal alcohol, a few preparations thought useful at the time. There were no antibiotics, no effective treatments for scurvy, no pain relief beyond alcohol and determination. Still, every item might someday save a life. The boats made repeated journeys through the surf. Some reached shore safely. Others nearly overturned before touching land. Strong currents constantly pulled at the oars. Freezing waves soaked everyone involved. Yet gradually, the survivors gathered on the beach. One after another. Cold, exhausted, alive. Not everyone managed the journey easily. Several men were already seriously ill from months at sea. Others had been injured during the grounding. Some could barely stand once they reached land. The island became an enormous open-air hospital before it became a camp. The officers immediately searched for a suitable place to establish shelter. The beach itself offered little protection from wind or rising tides. A short distance inland, however, the forest provided some relief. The trees astonished many of the British sailors. Towering southern beeches and other native species formed thick canopies overhead. Moss-covered fallen logs. Ferns spread across the damp ground. Everything seemed permanently wet. Rain began again before noon. Not a violent storm this time. Just a steady drizzle. The kind that quietly soaked clothing hour after hour. The sailors quickly discovered another challenge. Making fire. Their flint and steel still worked. Dry wood did not. Almost every branch lying on the forest floor had absorbed moisture. Finding kindling required splitting larger logs to reach the drier wood inside. Eventually thin streams of smoke rose from several small fires. Soon afterward came something even more welcome: warmth. Simple heat became one of the greatest comforts the survivors had experienced in months. Men crowded close around the flames, drying sleeves, boots, and blankets whenever possible. Others began constructing temporary shelters. Canvas sails removed from the wreck became roofs. Masts served as support poles. Rope tied everything together. It was hardly comfortable, but it kept some of the rain away. As afternoon wore on, more supplies reached the shore. The stranded ship still held useful stores, but everyone understood the opportunity would not last forever. The tides continued pounding the hull. Large sections had already begun collapsing. The carpenter inspected her from the rocks. His conclusion remained unchanged. The ship was dying. Over the next several days, salvage operations continued whenever weather allowed. Teams returned repeatedly to the wreck. They removed timber, rigging, blocks and tackle, metals, cooking equipment, anything portable, anything useful. The sea reclaimed a little more of HMS Voyager after every tide. Her once proud appearance disappeared piece by piece. To the sailors who had lived aboard her for months, watching the vessel slowly break apart carried unexpected emotion. A warship became more than transportation. It became home. Its familiar creaks, its narrow passageways, its guns, its masts, its routines. Now those familiar surroundings vanished beneath the waves. Many later remembered feeling as though part of their own lives disappeared with the ship. By evening, the survivors attempted something they had not enjoyed in many months: proper meal on land. It was hardly luxurious. Salted meat remained the main course. Ship's biscuit remained hard. But they no longer had to balance bowls while the floor rolled beneath them. For the first time since leaving Britain, the ground remained perfectly still. Some sailors admitted the sensation felt strange. Their bodies had grown accustomed to constant movement. Even standing motionless required adjustment. That first night ashore brought mixed emotions. There was gratitude. They had survived one of the world's most dangerous seas. There was relief. The immediate terror of sinking had passed. There was uncertainty. No one knew how long they would remain stranded. Most importantly, there was hope. Hope that another British ship might eventually appear. Hope that they could repair one of the boats. Hope that rescue remained possible. The officers discussed options late into the evening. The maps they possessed showed only rough outlines of the region. They believed they had wrecked somewhere along the remote Patagonian coast, but their precise location remained uncertain. One possibility involved waiting. Perhaps Commodore Anson would realize Voyager had disappeared. Perhaps search parties might come. Another possibility involved traveling north. Spanish settlements existed far beyond the wilderness. Reaching them would require an extraordinary journey by boat through unknown channels and hostile territory. The debate would continue. For now, survival came first. The camp slowly settled into silence. Rain tapped softly against stretched canvas. Small fires glowed beneath the trees. The crash of distant waves echoed across the darkness where HMS Voyager still rested upon the rocks. Out at sea, another powerful tide was rising. Before many more days had passed, the ship that had carried them across the Atlantic and nearly around Cape Horn would disappear forever beneath the Pacific waters. The survivors would no longer think of themselves as sailors aboard a Royal Navy warship. From that moment forward, they would become castaways, isolated on an unknown island, carrying the discipline of the British Navy into a wilderness where naval rules would soon be tested more severely than anyone could have imagined. The first full week on the island quickly taught the survivors a difficult lesson. Escaping the ship had not ended their struggle. It had merely changed its shape. Instead of battling towering waves and hurricane-force winds aboard HMS Voyage, they now faced an unforgiving wilderness along the remote coast of southern Chile. The dangers looked different, but they were no less real. Every morning began with dampness. Canvas shelters sagged beneath constant drizzle. Blankets never completely dried. Boots remained soaked. Smoke from the campfires drifted lazily through the trees, often refusing to rise because the air itself seemed saturated with moisture. Many sailors joked that the island had only two kinds of weather, rain and rain that was about to begin. The humor helped, at least for a while. Captain David Cheap knew that discipline could not disappear simply because the ship was gone. Although HMS Voyage no longer floated, Royal Navy regulations still governed the survivors. Watches were assigned. Food stores were inventoried. Salvage parties continued visiting the wreck whenever conditions allowed. Each day, another section of the ship vanished beneath the sea. The stern had begun breaking apart. Cabins that once belonged to officers now filled with seawater during every high tide. Loose planks drifted ashore. Broken spars floated among the rocks. The carpenter viewed every piece of timber as valuable. Nothing was wasted. Wood became shelter. Wood became firewood. Wood became tables, benches, racks for drying clothing, and stronger supports for the growing camp. The camp itself slowly became more organized. Tents made from sails were arranged in rows. Cooking fires occupied one area. Medical care another. Weapons and powder were stored as carefully as the damp climate allowed. Small pathways appeared as hundreds of footsteps wore away the moss-covered ground. It almost resembled a tiny military settlement. Almost. Because one enormous problem remained unsolved. Food. The rescued provisions looked plentiful at first. Barrels lined the edge of the camp. Stacks of ship's biscuit rested beneath canvas coverings. Salted meat remained available. But Captain Cheap understood arithmetic. More than 100 mouths consumed enormous quantities every day. Even reduced rations disappeared surprisingly quickly. The supplies could not last forever. The island itself offered some assistance. Fresh water flowed from nearby streams. That alone greatly improved morale. For months the crew had depended upon water stored in wooden casks, where it often became stale and unpleasant. Now they drank cold mountain water directly from clear streams. Tasted cleaner than many could remember. Fresh water solved one problem. Solved nothing else. Hunting parties entered the forest. The woods appeared full of life, yet finding edible animals proved surprisingly difficult. The dense vegetation made movement slow. Visibility rarely extended more than a short distance. Birds could be heard constantly. Actually catching them was another matter entirely. Fishing offered greater promise. The coastline supported fish, shellfish, and mussels. Groups gathered shellfish whenever tides allowed. Others lowered simple fishing lines into sheltered waters. Sometimes they returned successful. Sometimes they returned nearly empty-handed. Nature provided enough to supplement the remaining stores. Not enough to replace them. Meanwhile, sickness continued spreading through the camp. Scurvy remained the greatest enemy. Months without fresh fruits and vegetables had already damaged many bodies before the shipwreck. Living ashore slowed the decline for some, particularly those able to gather wild plants and shellfish containing modest amounts of nutrients, but no one understood exactly why certain men improved while others worsened. The surgeon could only observe. Healthy gums did not suddenly return. Loose teeth remained loose. Old wounds still healed poorly. Some men grew so weak they struggled simply to walk from their shelters to the fires. Others developed fevers from infected cuts received during the wreck. Cold, wet conditions complicated every recovery. A small scratch could become dangerous. The island seemed determined to prevent complete healing. Despite these hardships, work continued every day. The officers recognized that idleness encouraged despair. Carpenters strengthened shelters. Sailmakers repaired damaged canvas. Blacksmiths, working with rescued tools, attempted simple repairs whenever they could maintain sufficient heat. Everyone capable of labor received some assignment. Routine gave structure to uncertainty. Yet beneath the appearance of order, tension quietly accumulated. Months aboard ship had already strained relationships. The wreck intensified every disagreement. Some sailors questioned decisions made before the grounding. Had navigation errors brought them here? Should different courses have been chosen? Could the disaster have been avoided altogether? Such conversations usually occurred around evening fires, spoken quietly after officers walked away. No one openly challenged authority. Not yet. Still, frustration lingered. The officers themselves disagreed over the future. Waiting indefinitely carried enormous risks. Food diminished each week. Winter would eventually arrive. The isolated island offered little chance that another British vessel would simply appear. Traveling seemed equally dangerous. The surviving boats had suffered damage. The coastline northward stretched for hundreds of miles through unfamiliar channels, powerful tides, and territory controlled by Spain. Neither choice promised safety. Captain Cheap generally favored preserving naval discipline while considering future movement carefully. Others worried that hesitation might prove fatal. The discussions remained professional, but the differences became increasingly noticeable. One afternoon, several sailors climbed a nearby ridge hoping for a clearer view of the surrounding region. After hours of difficult climbing through dense forest, they reached an open point overlooking the sea. The view was breathtaking. Countless islands stretched across the horizon. Narrow waterways twisted between mountains. Mist drifted over distant channels. The Pacific seemed endless, beautiful, silent. Not a single sail appeared anywhere. No British squadron. No merchant vessel. No fishing boats. Nothing. The realization struck hard. They were utterly alone. When the scouting party returned to camp that evening, they carried little encouragement beyond confirming what everyone already feared. Rescue would not arrive tomorrow. Perhaps not next month. Perhaps not at all. As darkness settled once more over the island, the survivors gathered around their fires. Some spoke quietly about home. About wives waiting in Portsmouth. About children growing older without them. About parents who might already believe them dead. Others simply stared into the flames. The sea had spared their lives. Now time itself had become their newest enemy. Every passing day consumed another portion of their food. Every passing day weakened more men. Every passing day forced Captain Cheap and his officers closer to a decision that would determine whether the survivors remained together as disciplined sailors, or risked everything by attempting one of the most dangerous escape journeys in the history of the Royal Navy. As the days turned into weeks, the camp settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and unsettling. Each sunrise brought familiar tasks: collect fresh water, gather firewood, check the fishing lines, search the shoreline after every tide for useful timber carried in from the wreck, inspect the remaining food stores, repair shelters that had sagged under another night of relentless rain. The routine kept hands busy. Busy hands often kept worried minds quiet. But no amount of work could hide the truth. The provisions rescued from HMS Wager were shrinking. Captain David Cheap ordered the rations reduced once again. No one welcomed the announcement, though everyone understood the reason. A smaller portion today might mean another week of survival later. Each sailor received carefully measured amounts of salted meat, biscuit, and whatever fresh shellfish or fish had been collected that day. Meals ended more quickly now. There was little conversation while eating. Every crumb mattered. Some men quietly tucked away fragments of biscuit for later. Others finished every bite immediately, knowing hunger would return long before morning. The officers noticed another change. The men had begun speaking more frequently about home. Not in loud conversations, in quiet memories. One sailor remembered walking through the crowded streets of London before joining the Navy. Another described the fishing villages along the coast of Cornwall. Someone else recalled the smell of fresh bread coming from a bakery near Portsmouth Harbour. These simple memories became a form of comfort. The island offered no familiar sights, no familiar sounds, only rain, forest, and the endless roar of the Pacific. The wilderness itself slowly revealed more of its character. Exploration parties ventured farther from camp, always carrying muskets, axes, and enough supplies to return before darkness. The forests proved remarkably dense. Massive southern beech trees stretched high overhead, their branches covered in thick moss that trapped moisture from nearly every passing cloud. Fallen logs blocked easy travel. Small streams crossed the landscape in every direction. The ground remained soft beneath their boots. Walking only a few miles required hours of effort. The men soon realized they were not simply stranded on an island. They were stranded within one of the most isolated coastal wildernesses on Earth. One scouting party climbed another ridge overlooking the sea. From its summit they counted island after island disappearing into the mist. Some were little more than rocky outcrops. Others supported thick forests like the one surrounding their camp. Between them flowed narrow channels where powerful currents twisted through the landscape. The geography explained why navigation had proven so difficult. Even experienced European sailors possessed only the roughest understanding of this coast. To anyone without local knowledge, the maze of islands looked endless. Back at camp, the carpenter and his assistants had begun examining the surviving boats more carefully. Several boats had reached shore with damage from the wreck. Broken ribs, cracked planking, leaking seams, missing fittings. Yet none appeared beyond repair. Using timber salvaged from HMS Wager, they slowly restored each craft. Every repaired plank represented another small possibility. Perhaps these boats might someday carry them away. The repairs demanded patience. Iron nails were carefully removed from broken wreckage and hammered straight for reuse. Tar was heated to seal seams. Canvas was patched repeatedly. Nothing could be wasted. Everything required ingenuity. Meanwhile, the weather reminded everyone that winter in the southern hemisphere would eventually approach. Cold winds became more frequent. Night temperatures dropped noticeably. Morning frost occasionally appeared in sheltered areas. The survivors had escaped one disaster only to discover that time itself threatened another. The camp surgeon remained constantly occupied. Scurvy continued affecting many of the men. Swollen gums made eating difficult. Weakness spread through limbs that had once hauled heavy ropes with ease. Some sailors developed infections that refused to heal in the damp climate. Simple cuts became dangerous. A twisted ankle might leave a man unable to contribute to the daily work for weeks. Medical knowledge in 1741 offered few effective treatments. The surgeon did what he could. He cleaned wounds, applied bandages, recommended rest whenever possible. Beyond that, nature determined the outcome. Not every story ended badly. Fishing gradually improved as several sailors learned where local fish gathered during changing tides. They fashioned additional hooks from bent metal. Nets were repaired from damaged rope. The shoreline also supplied mussels and limpets in considerable numbers. These foods did not replace the dwindling ship stores, but they added welcome variety. For a brief time morale improved. Yet beneath the surface, another problem continued growing. Leadership. Captain Cheap remained convinced that Royal Navy authority must continue exactly as before. To him, the ship no longer existed, but the chain of command certainly did. Orders remained orders. Disobedience remained unacceptable. Many officers agreed. Without discipline, they believed, the camp would descend into chaos. Several sailors quietly questioned that idea. Their reasoning was simple. They were no longer aboard a commissioned warship. They were stranded hundreds of miles from civilization. Survival, they argued privately, sometimes required different priorities than naval regulations. These conversations remained cautious. No one openly challenged Captain Cheap. Still, opinions hardened. One officer whose influence steadily increased among the men was the ship's gunner, John Bulkeley. Bulkeley possessed years of practical maritime experience. He understood boats, navigation, supplies. He also earned respect from many ordinary sailors because he often shared their hardships directly. Unlike some officers, he spent long hours helping repair boats, organizing salvage work, and solving practical problems. His calm manner appealed to exhausted men searching for reassurance. Captain Cheap noticed Bulkeley's growing popularity. There was no immediate conflict. Professional respect remained outwardly intact. But differences in judgment began appearing more frequently during discussions about the future. Should they remain on the island until rescue came? Should they attempt to sail north toward Spanish settlements? Should they build a larger vessel from salvaged timber? Every option carried enormous risks. No clear answer existed. One evening, after another cold rain had passed, the survivors gathered around several fires. The flames reflected from damp faces as darkness settled over the forest. Someone quietly began singing an old naval ballad. Another sailor joined in. Soon several voices blended together. The song was soft and hurried. For a few precious minutes, the island no longer felt entirely foreign. The music reminded them of taverns, busy harbors, and ships that still sailed beneath familiar skies. When the final notes faded, silence returned. Only the distant surf could be heard. Out beyond those waves lay the Pacific Ocean that had carried them here. Somewhere beyond that vast horizon, Commodore George Anson continued his expedition, unaware that one of his ships had vanished. The survivors around the fire could not know that history would remember their shipwreck. Nor could they imagine that the greatest trial of the Voyager expedition would not come from storms, hunger, or isolation. It would come when men who had survived together were forced to decide whether loyalty to naval command was more important than the desperate instinct to save their own lives. The island grew quieter as the weeks passed, not because there were fewer men, because there was less strength left for unnecessary conversation. The endless labor continued from sunrise until darkness, but every task seemed to require a little more effort than it had before. Shoulders tired more quickly. Hands that had once hauled heavy anchor cables across the decks of HMS Voyager now paused after carrying a single barrel across the camp. Hunger changes people slowly. It rarely announces itself with sudden drama. Instead, it steals energy one day at a time. Captain David Cheap could see it. So could every officer. The food stores were no longer measured in abundance, but in calculations. Each morning the purser carefully counted the remaining barrels. Each evening another small portion had disappeared forever. The arithmetic was impossible to ignore. Even with reduced rations and whatever fish or shellfish could be gathered, the camp could not remain here indefinitely. The officers met frequently to discuss their future. These meetings became longer. Sometimes they lasted well into the evening, lit only by candles salvaged from the wreck. Charts were spread across rough wooden tables fashioned from pieces of the ship. The maps revealed very little. The western coast of South America remained one of the least accurately charted regions known to European navigators. There were outlines, few names, large stretches marked only by uncertainty. The survivors knew they were somewhere among the countless islands of the Patagonian archipelago. Exactly where remained uncertain. John Bulkeley listened carefully during every discussion. As the ship's gunner, his official responsibilities had centered on the artillery aboard Voyager. Yet years at sea had also given him practical knowledge of navigation, boats, tides, and survival. He increasingly believed that waiting offered little hope. Every passing week weakened the men. Every passing week reduced their chances of completing a long journey should one eventually become necessary. Several other officers quietly agreed. Captain Cheap remained cautious. He understood the risks of remaining. He understood equally well the dangers of leaving. The surviving boats had been repaired, but they remained open craft. They were never designed to carry large numbers of men through hundreds of miles of exposed coastline battered by Pacific storms. One heavy sea could overturn them. One navigation error could end the journey before it truly began. No decision seemed safe. Meanwhile, life beyond the camp continued, revealing unexpected discoveries. One morning, a foraging party ventured farther along the shoreline than ever before. The tide had fallen unusually low. Rocky pools appeared where waves normally crashed. The sailors found mussels in remarkable numbers. Barnacles clung thickly to the rocks. Seaweed covered much of the shoreline. Several kinds proved edible after boiling. The discoveries encouraged further exploration. Although these foods could not fully replace the lost naval provisions, they demonstrated that the coastline offered more resources than initially believed. Fresh fish also became more common. Experienced seamen quickly recognized favorable fishing grounds. Improvised hooks fashioned from bent metal performed surprisingly well. The ocean that had nearly destroyed them now became one of their few dependable sources of nourishment. Nature offered balance in unexpected ways. The forest, however, remained difficult. Game animals were scarce. Birds could often be heard high among the trees, but dense foliage made hunting frustrating. The damp undergrowth muffled footsteps while simultaneously limiting visibility. Hours of searching often produced little reward. The men gradually focused more attention upon the sea than the land. The surgeon noticed slight improvements among a handful of sailors who regularly ate fresh shellfish and fish. He could not explain why. Medical science had not yet identified the true cause of scurvy. Still, practical observation mattered. Fresh food appeared beneficial. Whenever possible, the weakest men received larger portions of whatever had been freshly gathered. The improvement remained modest. Too many months at sea had already inflicted serious damage. One afternoon, while salvage parties worked near the remains of HMS Voyage, they witnessed the final destruction of the ship. For weeks, tides had steadily weakened what remained of the hull. Now another powerful swell rolled in from the Pacific. The broken stern shifted. Heavy timbers groaned loudly. Then, with a tremendous cracking sound, a large section collapsed into the surf. The sea immediately carried away beams that had once supported officers' cabins. Another wave followed. More of the wreck disappeared. The sailors watched quietly from the rocks. Few spoke. There was little left to say. For nearly a year, that ship had carried them across the Atlantic Ocean, through storms, sickness, and endless hardship. Now it ceased to exist. Only scattered fragments remained. Some drifted toward shore. Most vanished forever beneath the waves. The wreck could no longer be considered a reserve of supplies. Whatever had not already been recovered belonged to the ocean now. Back at camp, attention turned increasingly toward the boats. The carpenter supervised careful inspections every day. Seams were recaulked, oars repaired, masts strengthened. Additional storage compartments were fashioned from salvaged timber. The boats gradually became sturdier than they had been immediately after the wreck. Even so, everyone recognized their limitations. They remained small open vessels. Cold rain would fall directly upon the men. Breaking waves would wash across the gunwales. There would be no comfortable cabins. No protection from storms. No certainty of finding safe landing places each evening. Any future voyage would demand extraordinary endurance. As preparations quietly advanced, differences between Captain Cheap and John Bulkeley became more noticeable. The disagreements remained respectful. Neither man doubted the courage of the other. Their conflict centered upon judgment. Cheap believed discipline required patience and careful planning. Bulkeley increasingly believed delay itself had become dangerous. Neither could prove his position correct. History had not yet revealed which choice offered the greater chance of survival. The ordinary sailors observed these conversations closely. Leadership mattered now more than ever. Their lives might soon depend upon whichever course the officers selected. Every passing day forced the decision nearer. Another concern also emerged: the approaching winter. The southern hemisphere followed seasons opposite those in Britain. Temperatures continued falling. Storms grew more frequent. Longer nights reduced opportunities for fishing and gathering food. The camp had survived the mild part of the year. The harsher months approached steadily. Remaining through winter carried serious consequences. The boats, though imperfect, represented movement. Movement represented hope. Yet movement also meant leaving the relative safety of the camp behind forever. That evening, the fires burned later than usual. Groups of sailors spoke quietly beneath patched canvas shelters while rain tapped softly overhead. Some favored departure. Others feared it. Most simply wished someone could promise the correct answer. No such promise existed. Within the coming weeks, the discussions would become decisions. And once those decisions were made, the unity that had held the survivors together since the wreck would begin to fracture in ways none of them could yet fully imagine. The debate that had quietly simmered for weeks could no longer be postponed. Every morning the camp awoke to the same questions. How much food remained? How much longer could they stay? How many of the sick still had the strength to travel? No one could answer with confidence. The inventory of provisions became a daily ritual. Barrels were opened, weighed, and carefully resealed. Biscuit was counted. Salted meat was divided into smaller and smaller portions. Even the smallest waste drew immediate attention. There would be no replacements. Everything the camp possessed had either come from HMS Voyage or from the island itself. The island had been generous in some ways. Fresh water flowed freely. Shellfish remained plentiful along certain stretches of shoreline. Fish could usually be caught when the weather allowed. But the sea did not cooperate every day. Strong winds often prevented fishing. High tides buried the shellfish beneath crashing waves. Storms sometimes trapped everyone inside the camp for days at a time. Nature gave. Nature also took away. Captain David Cheap gathered his officers once more. The discussion centered on the boats. Several had now been repaired as thoroughly as possible using timber and iron salvaged from the wreck. Their seams had been recaulked. Oars had been reshaped. Spare sails had been patched together from whatever canvas remained usable. The boats floated well enough in sheltered water. The question was whether they could survive the journey ahead. The intended destination remained the Spanish settlements far to the north. The nearest significant settlement known to British charts was believed to be on the island of Chiloé, part of the Spanish colonial frontier. Beyond that lay larger towns under Spanish authority. The irony was impossible to ignore. Britain and Spain were at war. If they reached Spanish territory, they might become prisoners. If they remained where they were, they might starve. Prison at least offered food. Starvation offered none. Some officers argued that surrendering to the Spanish, if treated according to the customs of war, might ultimately save their lives. Others worried that isolated colonial authorities might not receive British naval officers kindly. The uncertainty made every choice uncomfortable. John Bulkeley spoke with practical calm. He reminded the officers that remaining indefinitely was itself a decision that consumed food while accomplishing nothing. Each week more men weakened. If they intended to travel, they should leave while enough sailors still possessed the strength to row. Several officers quietly nodded. Captain Cheap listened carefully. He did not dismiss Bulkeley's reasoning. Yet he remained concerned about rushing into an expedition through waters almost entirely unknown to them. The coastline ahead consisted of countless islands, narrow passages, hidden reefs, and violent tidal currents. The charts were incomplete. The weather unpredictable. One overturned boat could cost dozens of lives. Meanwhile, ordinary sailors noticed the changing mood. Around the campfires, conversations no longer focused mainly on home. Instead, they focused on the future. If we leave. If we stay. Every sentence seemed to begin the same way. No one argued loudly, but opinions became increasingly firm. One afternoon, a hunting party returned with disappointing news. After hours in the forest, they had found almost nothing. The island simply could not provide enough land animals to feed such a large group. Fishing remained their greatest source of fresh food. That discovery strengthened Bulkeley's argument. The camp could survive for a time, not forever. The carpenter continued improving the boats whenever weather permitted. He added reinforcing timbers wherever possible. Extra thole pins were carved for the oars. Storage areas were rearranged to carry provisions more efficiently. Every improvement increased confidence slightly. Still, no one confused these boats with ocean-going ships. They remained open craft. Rain would soak everyone aboard. Cold winds would blow directly across the men. Sleeping during the journey would be difficult. The voyage itself promised no comfort. The surgeon also presented his observations. Several patients had deteriorated noticeably. Scurvy continued affecting gums and joints. Long exposure to damp conditions had produced chronic coughs among many survivors. The sickest men might not survive another winter on the island. Nor, he admitted honestly, might they survive a long voyage. Medicine offered no easy solution. The officers thanked him for his candor. His report only deepened the dilemma. Then another problem emerged. Not all the boats could carry everyone safely. The repaired craft had limited capacity. They also needed room for food, water, tools, weapons, sails, and navigation equipment. Every additional passenger reduced available supplies. Every additional barrel reduced available seating. Simple mathematics forced uncomfortable conversations. Who should travel first? Should the strongest row? Should the weakest receive priority? Should officers decide? Should experience determine placement? No answer satisfied everyone. Captain Cheap insisted that naval order remain the guiding principle. The chain of command still existed. Assignments would follow established authority. Bulkeley understood the necessity of order, yet he also recognized the practical concerns raised by the crew. Successful navigation required capable sailors at every oar. Survival depended upon cooperation more than rank alone. The distinction seemed small. In reality, it reflected two very different philosophies of leadership. One centered upon authority, the other upon practicality. Neither man realized how sharply those philosophies would soon collide. As evening approached, the weather briefly cleared. For the first time in many days, the western horizon glowed with a pale golden light beneath broken clouds. Several sailors climbed a nearby rise overlooking the sea. The Pacific stretched endlessly before them. Beautiful, silent, me. Not a single sail interrupted the horizon. Weeks had become months. No rescue ship had appeared. No distant mast hinted that the Royal Navy searched for them. The expedition under Commodore George Anson had continued without them. Whether Anson believed wager lost, delayed, or still attempting to round Cape Horn, no one on the island could know. Back in camp, the evening meal passed quietly. The reduced ration disappeared quickly. Some men lingered beside the fires long after darkness fell. Others retired early beneath damp canvas shelters. Captain Cheap remained awake with several officers, studying the worn charts once again. Bulkeley inspected the boats by lantern light one final time before returning to his shelter. Each man believed he was acting in the best interests of the survivors. Each man hoped to lead them home. Yet history would remember that the greatest challenge awaiting the castaways was no longer the wilderness around them. It was the growing divide within their own camp, a divide that would soon transform desperate shipwreck survivors into opposing factions, each convinced that only one path offered any real hope of seeing Britain again. By the time another week had passed, the island no longer felt like a temporary refuge. It had become a place of routines, responsibilities, and difficult decisions. The camp that had begun as a collection of hurried shelters now looked almost permanent. Canvas stretched between salvaged spars. Walkways of driftwood crossed the wettest patches of ground. Firewood was stacked beneath makeshift roofs. Fish were cleaned beside the stream, and tools recovered from the wreck were carefully arranged where everyone knew to find them. It was an orderly camp. Yet beneath that appearance, uncertainty lingered. Every man understood that they could not remain forever. The weather reminded them of this each day. Cold winds arrived more frequently from the south. Rainstorms rolled across the islands with little warning. Some mornings began beneath clear skies only to end in heavy mist and driving rain. The mountains surrounding the coastline seemed to create their own weather, trapping clouds that drifted slowly through the valleys before dissolving over the sea. For the survivors, dryness had become a luxury. Blankets remained damp. Clothing rarely dried completely. Even powder had to be inspected constantly to ensure it remained usable. Moisture found its way into everything. The officers ordered another careful review of the remaining provisions. Barrels were opened one by one. Some contained meat still suitable for eating. Others had spoiled despite every effort to preserve them. Ship's biscuit remained plentiful compared with other foods, though many pieces had become infested with insects. Few men complained. By now, they had long accepted that perfect food no longer existed. If it could be eaten safely, it was valuable. The carpenter reported encouraging news. The repaired boats were nearly ready. Weeks of careful work had strengthened their frames. Additional ribs fashioned from salvaged timber reinforced the hulls. Leaking seams had been sealed repeatedly with heated pitch. Fresh oars had been carved where old ones had broken. They were not new boats, but they were stronger than anyone had believed possible immediately after the wreck. The news spread quickly through the camp. Some sailors greeted it with optimism, others with concern. Preparing the boats meant the officers were moving closer to a decision. No one doubted that. What remained uncertain was which decision would be made. Captain David Cheap spent much of his time consulting with his senior officers. The discussions were serious but measured. No voices were raised. No one questioned another man's courage. Instead, they examined practical realities. How much food could each boat carry? How many men could safely fit aboard without sacrificing stability? How much fresh water would be required? Could they travel only during daylight? Would they camp ashore each night? The answers depended largely upon weather and geography. Unfortunately, both remained unpredictable. John Bulkeley continued advocating for departure, while enough healthy sailors remained capable of rowing. He argued that every week spent waiting reduced their chances. The strongest men slowly weakened. The sick became weaker still. The boats would never improve beyond their current condition. Neither would the weather necessarily become kinder. Captain Cheap understood those arguments. Still, he hesitated. He believed the journey demanded complete preparation. A poorly organized departure might prove more dangerous than remaining on the island. The debate continued. Meanwhile, ordinary sailors found themselves choosing sides quietly, though often without intending to do so. Some admired Cheap's caution. Others appreciated Bulkeley's practicality. Most simply hoped that whichever course was chosen would bring them home. One afternoon, several fishermen returned with unusually large catches. The sea had been calm for most of the day, allowing them to reach waters beyond the nearest rocks. They brought back enough fish to provide every man with a generous meal. Morale lifted noticeably. Fresh food always changed the atmosphere. Laughter returned around the cooking fires. Stories were exchanged. For a short time, the camp almost resembled the crew of a ship enjoying an unexpected success. Moments like these became precious. They reminded everyone that hope had not completely disappeared. The surgeon also observed that sailors receiving regular fresh fish seemed somewhat stronger than those living almost entirely on preserved rations. He could not explain the reason scientifically. The connection simply appeared repeatedly in his observations. He recommended continuing every effort to gather fresh food whenever possible. The advice was followed eagerly. Fishing parties became larger. More hooks were fashioned. Additional lines were woven from salvaged cordage. Every improvement mattered. Late one evening, after most of the camp had settled into uneasy sleep, heavy rain began once more. It fell steadily throughout the night. Streams overflowed their banks. Several shelters required immediate repair before dawn. The men worked silently beneath lantern light, securing ropes and adjusting canvas against the wind. No one complained. Such work had become ordinary. Yet fatigue showed on every face. Months of hardship had aged many of the survivors beyond their years. Beards had grown thick. Hair hung long beneath weathered hats. Sun, salt, rain, and cold had left deep marks on skin that had once appeared youthful. These were no longer the confident sailors who had departed Britain in 1740. They had become castaways shaped by survival. As daylight returned, Captain Cheap called another meeting. The boats stood nearby on the shore, ready for inspection. The officers walked slowly around each one, examining repairs, testing fittings, and discussing how supplies might best be arranged. The boats represented possibility. They also represented risk. Every man looking at them understood the same truth. Once they launched from this island, there would be no easy turning back. The camp that had protected them for weeks would disappear behind the horizon. Ahead would lie hundreds of miles of unfamiliar coastline, powerful tides, unpredictable weather, and territory claimed by Spain. No chart could guarantee safe passage. No officer could promise success. Only determination remained certain. As the meeting concluded, no final order was issued. The decision had not yet been announced. But the preparations were now too advanced to ignore. The island that had become their reluctant home was slowly being left behind, not in distance, but in the minds of the survivors. Soon they would have to choose between the uncertain safety of the shore and the equally uncertain hope carried by a handful of small wooden boats. And that choice would begin to reshape not only their journey, but the relationships among the men who had survived the wreck together. The days that followed brought no dramatic storm, no sudden rescue, and no miraculous discovery. Instead, they brought something that often proves far more difficult to endure: waiting. For the survivors of HMS Voyage, waiting had become its own kind of hardship. Every sunrise looked much like the one before it. A pale gray sky slowly brightened over the forested hills. Thin mist drifted among the trees before lifting toward the sea. Fires were stirred back to life after the damp night, and men quietly gathered around them, warming cold hands before beginning another day's work. The routine had become familiar. Fetch water, gather shellfish, check the fishing lines, repair clothing, inspect the boats, count the food, repeat. Routine helped preserve discipline, but it also reminded everyone that time continued slipping away. Captain David Cheap remained determined that the camp should function as though the Royal Navy itself still stood behind every order. Watches continued through the night. Daily assignments were given each morning. Supplies were issued only with permission. Many sailors accepted this naturally. Others had begun questioning whether the strict routines of a warship still suited men stranded in the wilderness. The disagreement remained largely unspoken. No one openly challenged the captain. Not yet. John Bulkeley spent much of his time near the shoreline, supervising the final work on the boats. The carpenter worked beside him, checking every repaired plank once again. They understood that even the smallest weakness could become fatal. An open boat navigating the channels of southern Chile faced countless dangers. Sharp rocks hidden below the surface, powerful tidal currents, sudden squalls sweeping down from the mountains, heavy Pacific swells entering narrow passages. There would be little margin for error. Every repair deserved careful attention. The men assigned to the boats practiced loading supplies. Barrels of food were arranged and rearranged. Fresh water casks were shifted to improve balance. Muskets, powder, spare sails, axes, ropes, and navigation instruments all required secure positions. Too much weight at one end might affect steering. Too much weight altogether could reduce freeboard, allowing waves to pour inside. Simple mistakes could cost lives. Several officers carefully calculated how much each boat could safely carry. The numbers remained discouraging. Space was extremely limited. The survivors themselves posed the greatest challenge. There were more men than the boats could comfortably accommodate. The officers understood that loading every available space might make the boats dangerously unstable. Leaving supplies behind seemed equally dangerous. Every extra day of food might determine whether the journey succeeded. Mathematics offered no easy compromise. One afternoon, the weather cleared more completely than it had in many weeks. Blue sky appeared overhead. Sunlight broke through the clouds and reached the camp for several precious hours. The sudden warmth transformed the island. Blankets were spread across rocks to dry. Clothing hung from ropes stretched between trees. Several sailors removed heavy coats for the first time in days. Even spirits seemed lighter. Groups took advantage of the weather to explore nearby beaches beyond the usual fishing grounds. One party discovered another small stream flowing from the hills. Another located driftwood suitable for repairing oars. A third returned carrying armfuls of edible shellfish collected during the unusually low tide. The day served as a welcome reminder that nature could occasionally be generous. That evening, the camp enjoyed one of its best meals since the shipwreck. Fresh fish roasted over open fires. Boiled shellfish. The familiar ration of biscuit. It was still a modest supper. Compared with recent weeks, however, it felt almost plentiful. Conversations became livelier. Stories from earlier voyages resurfaced. Older sailors described storms in the Atlantic. Others recalled long merchant voyages to the Caribbean or India. For a little while, laughter echoed through the camp. Yet beneath the pleasant atmosphere, uncertainty remained. Captain Cheap gathered several senior officers after the meal. They walked toward the beach where the repaired boats rested above the high water mark. The sea was calm. Only gentle waves reached the shore. It seemed difficult to imagine that this peaceful water belonged to the same ocean that had destroyed HMS Wager. Cheap studied the boats silently. He understood what they represented. Risk. Responsibility. If he ordered departure and the expedition failed, many lives might be lost. If he delayed too long, starvation and disease might claim those same lives on the island. History rarely presents perfect choices. Often it offers only imperfect ones. John Bulkeley joined the group shortly afterward. The discussion remained respectful. Both men wished to save the survivors. Their disagreement concerned timing rather than purpose. Bulkeley believed conditions were as favorable as they were likely to become. The boats were ready. The weather, though never predictable, had briefly improved. The men still possessed enough strength to row. Cheap acknowledged every point. Still, he hesitated to commit immediately. He wanted additional preparations completed first. Extra provisions packed. Navigation plans reviewed. Assignments finalized. Neither officer raised his voice. Neither questioned the other's loyalty. Yet everyone present sensed that the difference between caution and urgency was steadily widening. The ordinary sailors watched these developments closely. Around the fires that night, quiet conversations spread through the camp. Some believed Captain Cheap was wisely avoiding unnecessary danger. Others wondered whether waiting simply postponed the inevitable. No one possessed enough information to know with certainty. The island itself remained silent. The forest offered no answers. The sea revealed no distant sails. As darkness settled over the camp once again, lanterns glowed faintly beneath the canvas shelters. Beyond them, the repaired boats rested upon the shore, their hulls reflecting the firelight. Soon those boats would leave the beach. When they did, they would carry not only exhausted sailors and precious supplies. They would also carry growing differences in judgment, differences that, before long, would begin testing the authority of Captain David Cheap and the unity that had held the survivors together since the day HMS Voyager struck the rocks. The morning arrived with an unusual stillness. For the first time in many days, the wind barely stirred the tops of the trees. The surface of the nearby bay reflected the gray sky almost like polished glass, interrupted only by the occasional ripple of a feeding bird or the slow movement of the tide. The calm weather caught everyone's attention. Experienced sailors rarely trusted such moments completely. In the waters surrounding Cape Horn and the Patagonian coast, conditions could change within hours. Even so, the quiet offered an opportunity. Fishing parties pushed their small craft into the sheltered water before sunrise, hoping to make the most of it. Others walked the shoreline collecting shellfish exposed by the falling tide. The camp came alive earlier than usual. Captain David Cheap also recognized the value of the calm. He ordered another thorough inspection of every boat. Nothing was left to chance. Each hull was examined for fresh leaks. Every oarlock was tested. Masts, spars, and rigging were checked once more. Water casks were opened to ensure their contents remained fresh. Food barrels were counted again, then counted a second time. No officer wanted to discover a mistake after the boats had already left the island. John Bulkeley spent much of the morning beside the carpenter. Together they inspected the caulking between the planks. The damp climate constantly caused timber to swell and shrink. Even a seam that had appeared secure one day might begin leaking the next. Small repairs continued throughout the morning. No one complained. Every man understood that careful work now might save lives later. The camp itself had become surprisingly efficient. Weeks of necessity had taught everyone where supplies belonged and how work should be divided. Some men gathered firewood, others cleaned fish. Several repaired worn clothing using sailcloth and thread recovered from HMS Voyager. A few of the stronger sailors carried heavy timber from the shoreline for future use. There was purpose in every movement. Yet beneath that purpose lingered uncertainty. No one knew exactly how many more mornings they would spend on this island. The surgeon made his daily rounds. His observations remained troubling. Several men showed signs of worsening scurvy. Swollen gums bled easily. Old bruises darkened without fresh injury. Legs ached constantly. A few sailors struggled simply to stand after sleeping through the cold night. Fresh fish had helped some. It had not reversed months of nutritional damage. The surgeon quietly informed Captain Cheap that delaying much longer might leave certain men too weak to travel at all. The captain listened carefully. It was another difficult fact added to an already impossible decision. That afternoon, another meeting of the officers took place. The charts, though incomplete, lay spread across a rough wooden table built from salvaged planks. Navigation instruments rested beside them. The discussion centered on possible routes northward. The coastline offered two broad choices. One involved traveling through the maze of inner channels between islands. These waters provided some protection from the full force of the Pacific Ocean. However, they also presented dangerous tides, narrow passages, and uncertain navigation. The second option followed more open water. While potentially simpler to navigate, it exposed the boats directly to ocean swells and changing weather. Neither choice promised safety. The officers compared journals, observations, and whatever knowledge they possessed from previous voyages. Much of the coastline remained unfamiliar. Large sections had never been carefully surveyed by British navigators. Every proposed route relied partly upon educated guesswork. John Bulkeley favored using the inner channels whenever possible. Sheltered water, even if difficult to navigate, reduced the risk of large Pacific waves overwhelming the boats. Several experienced seamen agreed. Captain Cheap acknowledged the advantages. Still, he reminded everyone that narrow passages might also trap them if contrary winds or strong currents developed. The discussion lasted for hours. No complete agreement emerged. Evening approached before the officers finally returned to the camp. The ordinary sailors watched them carefully. Expressions often revealed as much as words. The men noticed that the discussions had grown more frequent. Something important was approaching. That night, the weather shifted once again. Clouds rolled inland from the sea. Rain followed shortly afterward. Not violent rain. Steady rain. The kind that soaked clothing without attracting much attention until hours had passed. Inside the shelters, men lay awake listening to droplets striking stretched canvas overhead. Some thought about home. Others thought about the journey ahead. A few simply stared into the darkness. Sleep came slowly. Captain Cheap also remained awake longer than usual. Leadership carried a particular burden. Every possible decision seemed to involve danger. Remain on the island, and disease or starvation might eventually overcome them. Leave the island, and the sea might finish what the wreck had begun. History often remembers outcomes. It rarely captures the weight of making such choices before anyone knows how events will unfold. By dawn, the rain had eased. Mist drifted low across the shoreline. The repaired boats stood waiting above the tide line. They looked small against the vast landscape surrounding them. Small against the towering forests. Small against the endless Pacific beyond. Small against the responsibility they would soon carry. Captain Cheap walked alone toward the beach. He paused beside the nearest boat, placing one hand upon its weathered gunwale. The timber beneath his fingers had once formed part of HMS Voyage. The ship was gone. Only these boats remained. Behind him, the camp slowly awakened. Fires were lit. Breakfast was prepared. The familiar routine continued. But something had changed. The long weeks of preparation were ending. Soon orders would replace discussions. Plans would replace debate. The survivors who had worked side by side since the shipwreck would begin a journey that promised hardship unlike anything they had yet experienced. And before many more days had passed, the strain of that journey would begin testing not only their endurance, but also the authority of the officers who claimed the right to lead them through one of the most remote coastlines in the world. The weather held steady for another day. Along this remote stretch of the Chilean coast, that alone felt remarkable. The wind remained moderate. The rain came only in short showers, and the sea inside the nearby channels appeared calmer than it had in weeks. Experienced sailors knew such conditions could disappear without warning, but they also understood that favorable weather should never be wasted. Captain David Cheap ordered the preparations to continue. The announcement spread quietly through the camp. No drum was beaten. No formal ceremony marked the moment. Men simply returned to their assigned tasks with renewed purpose. The boats were hauled closer to the water. Food stores were measured once again. Every barrel was weighed against every available space aboard the small craft. Nothing could be loaded carelessly. Balance meant survival. The carpenter supervised the distribution of heavier supplies. Water casks were placed low within the boats to keep their centers of gravity stable. Bundles of canvas were wrapped carefully to protect them from spray. Muskets were secured where they could be reached quickly if needed, but also protected from constant moisture. Axes, ropes, spare oars, and navigation instruments each received their place. The boats began to resemble floating storehouses. John Bulkeley moved quietly among the crews, offering practical advice gathered from decades at sea. He reminded the men to keep personal belongings to an absolute minimum. A spare shirt occupied valuable space. An unnecessary tool added weight. Every pound mattered. Several sailors reluctantly abandoned small keepsakes they had carried since leaving Britain. One left behind a wooden pipe that had belonged to his father. Another chose not to pack an extra blanket. One man quietly buried a few personal letters beneath a large stone near the camp, believing that carrying them might cost someone else precious room. No one knew whether those letters would ever be seen again. The surgeon also prepared carefully. His medical chest had survived the wreck, though many supplies were already depleted. Bandages were dried near the fire. Surgical instruments were cleaned as thoroughly as circumstances allowed. Alcohol was divided among smaller containers in case one should be lost overboard. He knew that injuries during the voyage were almost inevitable. His greatest concern, however, remained the condition of the men themselves. Several sailors had grown alarmingly weak. Scurvy had reduced their strength despite the fresh fish and shellfish gathered from the island. Swollen joints made rowing painful. Loose teeth made eating difficult. Even walking across the camp exhausted some of them. The surgeon quietly questioned whether they could endure a journey lasting many weeks. No one had a better alternative. As preparations continued, small groups of sailors wandered through the camp one final time. They inspected the shelters they had built from salvaged sails. They looked at the cooking fires that had warmed them through countless cold evenings. They walked the narrow paths worn into the damp ground by months of footsteps. Without intending to, many had begun thinking of the place as home. It had never been comfortable. It had never been safe. Yet it had kept them alive. Leaving it stirred unexpected emotions. One elderly seaman paused beside the stream where he had fetched water almost every morning since the wreck. He filled his tin cup one last time and drank slowly. The water was cold and perfectly clear. He later remarked that it was the finest fresh water he had tasted in his life. Others climbed a nearby rise overlooking the bay. From there they could still see scattered timbers from HMS Wager washing against the rocks during the changing tide. Months earlier, that great ship had represented the power of the Royal Navy. Now only fragments remained. Nature had reclaimed almost everything. The officers gathered again before sunset. This meeting differed from earlier discussions. Most practical questions had already been answered. The boats were as ready as they could be. The provisions had been packed. The route, though uncertain, had been chosen as carefully as available charts allowed. Now they reviewed responsibilities. Each boat required experienced sailors at the oars. Each needed someone capable of navigation, someone responsible for provisions, someone responsible for maintaining discipline. Orders were discussed calmly and methodically. Captain Cheap reminded the officers that the chain of command remained unchanged. Though they were no longer aboard a commissioned vessel, they were still officers and sailors of the Royal Navy. The regulations under which they served continued to guide them. Several officers nodded in agreement. Others remained thoughtful. No one argued openly. Still, the subtle differences in philosophy had not disappeared. John Bulkeley accepted the captain's authority. Yet he also believed practical decisions during the voyage might require flexibility impossible under ordinary naval routine. The distinction seemed slight. It would later become enormously important. That evening the camp enjoyed another meal of freshly caught fish alongside the remaining preserved rations. Conversation flowed quietly around the fires. Some sailors spoke of England. Others discussed the route northward. A few wondered what kind of reception they might receive if they reached Spanish settlements. They knew Britain and Spain remained at war. Would they be treated as prisoners? Would local officials honor the customs extended to captured naval personnel? Would they survive the journey only to spend years in captivity? No one knew. Still, captivity seemed preferable to dying alone upon a forgotten island. As darkness settled across the forest, the fires gradually burned lower. The sounds of the camp became softer. Rain tapped gently against the canvas roofs. Some men slept quickly, exhausted by another day of labor. Others remained awake, listening to the distant surf. Captain Cheap walked once more along the shoreline before retiring. The boats rested where the tide could not reach them. Everything appeared ready. He looked out across the water. The horizon disappeared into darkness. Beyond that unseen distance lay hundreds of miles of dangerous channels, remote islands, powerful currents, and Spanish territory. It was an intimidating path. Yet remaining where they were no longer seemed possible. By the following days, the preparations that had occupied the survivors for so long would finally give way to movement. The island that had preserved their lives since the wreck would slowly disappear behind them. And with every mile traveled, The quiet differences of opinion that had lingered within the camp would become harder to contain, setting the stage for the extraordinary conflict that would eventually make the story of HMS Voyage one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of the Royal Navy. Morning arrived beneath a ceiling of low grey clouds. A light mist drifted across the shoreline, softening the outlines of the forest and the distant islands beyond. The sea remained unusually calm, broken only by the gentle rise and fall of the tide against the rocks where the remains of HMS Voyage had finally disappeared. The camp stirred earlier than usual. This was no ordinary day. 4 weeks, every repair, every inventory, and every discussion had led toward this moment. The survivors were preparing to leave the island that had preserved their lives since the shipwreck. There was no celebration, no cheering, only quiet determination. Men folded the canvas that had served as their roofs. Cooking fires were allowed to burn low before being carefully extinguished. Useful timber that could not be carried was stacked neatly beside the shelters. Nothing was destroyed. Some sailors quietly remarked that another unfortunate traveler might someday find these materials. Most doubted anyone ever would. Captain David Cheap moved steadily through the camp, speaking with the officers responsible for each boat. He inspected the loading one final time. Food barrels remained securely lashed. Water casks were balanced carefully between the thwarts. Muskets were wrapped in canvas to protect them from spray. Spare sails and rigging occupied every available space that remained. There was remarkably little room left for the men themselves. Every boat would carry a heavy burden. The carpenter walked around each hull once again. He ran his hands along the repaired seams, checking for any sign that the pitch had cracked overnight. The repairs held, as well as anyone could reasonably expect. He gave a quiet nod. Nothing more could be done. John Bulkeley gathered the sailors assigned to his boat and spoke plainly. He reminded them that rowing together mattered more than rowing hard. A steady rhythm conserved strength. Supplies must remain dry whenever possible. Every landing should be made cautiously. No unnecessary risks. His instructions reflected years spent at sea rather than formal naval language. The men listened closely. Nearby, the surgeon distributed the limited medical supplies among several trusted assistants. If the boats became separated during bad weather, each needed at least some means of treating injuries. Bandages were divided. Simple medicines shared. The medical chest itself could not hold everything. Compromise became necessary once again. As the final preparations continued, several sailors walked quietly to the edge of the forest. Some paused beside the simple graves of shipmates who had died after the wreck from injury or illness. The graves were modest. Wooden markers stood above them, carved with whatever names could still be remembered. No stone monuments, no church bells. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees. The men removed their hats. A few remained silent. Others offered brief prayers. Then they returned to the beach. Life demanded movement. By mid-morning, the tide had risen enough to float the boats. The order everyone had anticipated was finally given. The boats were pushed slowly into the water. Cold waves washed around the sailors' boots. Men climbed carefully aboard one after another, taking care not to upset the carefully balanced loads. Each movement required patience. One misplaced step could send precious supplies into the sea. Captain Cheap boarded his assigned boat only after ensuring the others had launched successfully. From the water, he looked back toward the shoreline. The camp appeared strangely small. Weeks of effort had transformed it into a place of relative order. Now it stood empty. Canvas shelters remained behind. The paths through the grass would gradually disappear. The forest would quietly reclaim everything. The island had sheltered them. Now it was becoming part of the past. The boats began moving together. Oars entered the water almost in unison. The first strokes felt awkward after so many weeks ashore. Soon the rhythm settled. Wood creaked softly. Water dripped from the blades. The shoreline slowly drifted away. No one spoke very much. Most simply watched the island recede behind them. Ahead stretched the maze of islands and channels that would guide them northward. The route followed sheltered waters wherever possible. Towering cliffs rose on either side. Dense forests reached almost to the water's edge. Mist drifted between the mountains, sometimes hiding entire islands before revealing them again moments later. The landscape possessed an almost unreal beauty. Silent, ancient, untouched. Few Europeans had ever seen these waterways. Fewer still had attempted to navigate them in small open boats. The survivors quickly discovered that traveling through the channels demanded constant attention. Powerful tidal currents flowed between the islands. Some passages accelerated the water so strongly that rowing alone accomplished little. The boats had to wait for favorable tides or hug the shoreline where the current weakened slightly. Progress proved slower than many had hoped. Still, they were moving. For the first time since HMS Voyage struck the rocks, the survivors once again possessed a destination. The weather remained kind throughout most of the day. Clouds occasionally released light rain, but no severe storms developed. The calm allowed the men to establish a steady pace. Whenever the tide or darkness made further travel unsafe, they searched for small beaches where the boats could be hauled ashore. Late that afternoon they found such a place. It offered little more than a narrow strip of stones between the forest and the sea. Even so, it was sufficient. The boats were pulled above the tide line. Shelters of canvas were erected quickly. Small fires appeared beneath overhanging rocks where they stood some chance against the damp wind. The evening meal was simple. Fish caught during the day. Carefully measured portion of biscuit. Fresh water collected from a nearby stream. Everyone ate quietly. The labor of rowing had reminded the survivors how much strength they had already lost. Tomorrow would demand the same effort. And the day after that. Perhaps for many weeks. As darkness settled across the channel, the boats rested side by side along the shore. Captain Cheap studied the maps once more beside the fire. John Bulkeley quietly examined the tide before retiring. Neither man could know exactly what awaited them beyond the next bend in the coast. But both understood one truth. The island was behind them now. There could be no turning back. From this point onward, every mile north would test not only their endurance against the wilderness, but also the fragile unity that still held the survivors together. A unity that would soon face its greatest challenge as hardship, exhaustion, and conflicting judgments began to reshape the expedition into something far more complicated than a simple escape. The first full days of travel revealed just how deceptive the maps had been. From the camp on the island, the route north had seemed difficult but possible. Looking across the channels, the distances appeared manageable. One island stood beyond another, and beyond that another still, each separated by narrow strips of water. Once the boats entered those waterways, everything changed. The channels twisted constantly. A passage that seemed to lead north suddenly curved west toward the open Pacific. Another narrowed into a rocky gap where the tide rushed through with astonishing speed. Hidden rocks lay only inches beneath the surface, invisible until a breaking ripple marked their position. The men quickly learned that rowing alone would never be enough. They had to work with the tides. Sometimes they waited patiently for hours until the current turned in their favor. At other times they rowed close to the shoreline, where the flow of water weakened slightly beneath overhanging cliffs. Progress became measured not in miles but in opportunities. Each favorable tide was a gift. Each contrary current stole precious time. The weather also returned to its familiar unpredictability. Morning often began quietly. By midday, cold rain swept across the channels. An hour later, sunlight briefly appeared before disappearing behind another curtain of mist. The boats remained exposed throughout. Every sailor grew wet sooner or later. The greatest challenge was not becoming soaked. It was remaining warm afterward. During brief stops ashore, the first priority was always fire. Several sailors had become remarkably skilled at finding dry wood hidden inside larger fallen branches. They split damp logs with axes recovered from HMS Voyage, exposing dry timber within. Soon smoke rose from small cooking fires. Clothing was spread over branches whenever the weather allowed. Boots stood beside the flames. Hands stretched toward the warmth. The pauses never lasted long. Food had to be conserved. Distance had to be covered. Captain David Cheap maintained strict organization. Each morning began with assignments. Certain boats led the way. Others followed at carefully chosen intervals. Lookouts watched continuously for reefs and sudden changes in weather. Whenever difficult passages approached, experienced seamen moved toward the bow, sounding the depth with lead lines whenever necessary. Discipline remained firm. John Bulkeley fully supported these practical precautions. He also spent considerable time speaking directly with the ordinary sailors. He encouraged steady rowing rather than bursts of exhausting effort. He reminded them to drink fresh water whenever streams were available. He often helped unload boats himself before resting. The men noticed. Leadership expressed through shared labor earned quiet respect. Several evenings into the journey, the expedition reached a wider stretch of water where the protection of the inner channels became less complete. Ocean swells rolled gently into the passage. The boats rose and fell more noticeably. No serious danger developed that day. Still, the movement reminded everyone how small their craft truly were. One large storm in such open water could overturn them all. The officers chose their campsites carefully. Whenever possible, they landed near fresh water. Sheltered coves became valuable. Steep cliffs sometimes protected them from the strongest winds. Dense forests supplied firewood in abundance. Yet the camps themselves remained temporary. Unlike the island they had left behind, no one invested time constructing lasting shelters. Canvas was stretched each evening, folded each morning. The journey allowed no permanence. Food remained an increasing concern. Fishing during travel proved less productive than fishing from their former camp. Time spent casting lines meant time not spent moving north. Some evenings the catch was excellent. Others yielded almost nothing. The preserved provisions slowly diminished. Captain Cheap continued reducing portions whenever necessary. No one argued openly. Hunger had become familiar. One afternoon, a scouting party climbed another ridge overlooking the surrounding waterways. From the summit, they could see mile after mile of islands fading into distant mist. The view was magnificent. It was also discouraging. The coastline seemed endless. The men had traveled several days. Yet they appeared to have crossed only a tiny portion of the vast archipelago. The realization spread quietly through the expedition. Their escape would not be measured in days. It would require weeks, perhaps longer. That evening, while the men rested around the fires, several officers reviewed their remaining charts. The maps continued proving frustratingly incomplete. Many channels before them appeared only as rough sketches. Some islands visible from camp did not appear at all. Navigation relied increasingly upon observation rather than paper. The sun, when visible, offered guidance. The tides offered clues. Experience mattered more than certainty. Captain Cheap accepted this reality. So did Bulkeley. Yet subtle differences between the two men became easier to notice. Cheap viewed careful adherence to naval order as the foundation of survival. Bulkeley increasingly emphasized flexibility and practical adaptation to local conditions. Neither philosophy had yet been tested beyond endurance. That test was approaching. The ordinary sailors sensed the changing atmosphere without fully understanding its cause. The officers still worked together. Orders still flowed through the proper chain of command. The boats still traveled as a single expedition. Yet conversations among the leadership had grown noticeably shorter, more deliberate. Each decision required greater discussion than before. As darkness settled over another temporary camp, rain began falling once again, soft at first, then steadily. The men lay beneath damp canvas listening to water striking the fabric overhead. Some drifted quickly into exhausted sleep. Others remained awake, thinking about the long route still ahead. Beyond the firelight, The boats rested along the shoreline. Their hulls glistened beneath the rain. They carried the hopes of every survivor. They also carried growing pressures that could not remain hidden forever. With every mile northward, food became scarcer, fatigue became heavier, and leadership demanded more difficult choices. Soon, those choices would no longer concern only navigation or supplies. They would begin testing the loyalty of officers and sailors alike, setting the stage for the disagreements that would ultimately transform a remarkable survival story into one of the most controversial mutinies in British naval history. The journey continued one tide at a time. Every morning began before sunrise. The camp stirred quietly as the first grey light filtered through the trees. Fires were coaxed back to life from the previous night's embers. A simple breakfast of biscuit, dried provisions, or whatever fish had been caught the evening before was eaten without much conversation. The day's work waited. Canvas shelters were folded, cooking pots cleaned, water casks filled from nearby streams. Then, one after another, the boats were pushed back into the cold water. The routine soon became familiar. Whoa, watch the tides. Land before darkness. Bleep, repeat. Days blended together until many sailors lost track of the calendar entirely. Only the changing phases of the moon and the gradual shortening of daylight reminded them that time continued passing. The coastline never stopped changing. 1 hour they traveled beneath towering cliffs where waterfalls spilled directly into the sea. The next, they entered broad channels bordered by forests that stretched over rolling hills. Sometimes seals watched quietly from exposed rocks. Seabirds circled overhead, their calls echoing across the water. Occasionally dolphins appeared beside the boats, swimming effortlessly through the cold currents before disappearing beneath the waves. For brief moments, the wilderness seemed almost welcoming. Then the weather would change again. A cold squall could sweep through the channels with astonishing speed. Rain reduced visibility. Wind scattered the boats. The men bent harder to their oars while officers shouted directions above the rising gusts. Nature constantly reminded them who truly controlled these waters. Captain David Cheap insisted that the boats remain close enough to support one another. Whenever weather threatened, signals passed from one boat to the next. Raised or a shouted warning, a wave of the hand. The expedition had already learned the cost of separation during the voyage of HMS Wager. No one wished to repeat that lesson. Despite every precaution, maintaining formation proved difficult. Tides affected each boat differently depending upon its weight and position. Some crews rowed more efficiently than others. The strongest men naturally pulled ahead. Others struggled to keep pace. Frequent stops became necessary simply to gather everyone together again. These delays frustrated many of the sailors. Not because they questioned the captain's intentions, because every delay consumed precious daylight. Food also continued disappearing at an alarming rate. The preserved stores rescued from the wreck had seemed substantial while resting in the camp. Loaded into small boats, they looked far less impressive. Every meal required another barrel to be opened, another bag of biscuit to grow lighter. The officers carefully calculated remaining supplies each evening. The figures grew steadily more concerning. Fishing during the journey remained unpredictable. Some camps provided excellent catches. Others offered almost nothing. One evening the men gathered dozens of shellfish from nearby rocks. The following evening they found only empty shoreline beneath crashing waves. No reliable pattern emerged. The sea gave according to its own rules. The surgeon watched the men closely. Continuous rowing placed enormous strain upon bodies already weakened by months of hardship. Hands blistered despite old calluses. Shoulders stiffened. Legs cramped after hours sitting in the narrow boats. Several sailors developed painful swellings from constant exposure to cold, wet clothing. Illness spread more easily among exhausted men. Yet there was little opportunity for proper recovery. Stopping for several days meant consuming valuable food without making progress. The journey itself had become the treatment. Movement represented survival. One afternoon the expedition encountered one of the strongest tidal races they had yet seen. The narrow channel ahead forced enormous volumes of water between two rocky headlands. From a distance, the current resembled a fast-moving river flowing directly through the sea. Standing waves formed where opposing currents collided. Foam swirled across the surface. Captain Cheap ordered caution. The boats waited until the tide weakened before attempting the passage. Even then, rowing demanded every ounce of strength. The current repeatedly pushed the boats sideways toward jagged rocks. Experienced helmsmen fought constantly to maintain control. When the final boat emerged safely into calmer water, many of the sailors breathed deeply with relief. No lives had been lost. No boats damaged. Felt like a small victory. That evening the campfire conversations reflected growing fatigue. Men spoke less than before. Laughter had become uncommon. Most simply ate their modest meals before wrapping themselves in damp blankets. Sleep came quickly. John Bulkeley noticed the exhaustion as clearly as anyone. He quietly encouraged shorter rowing intervals whenever conditions allowed, believing that preserving strength mattered more than covering every possible mile. Captain Cheap remained focused upon maintaining steady daily progress. Their differing approaches still produced no open conflict. Yet the contrast became easier to observe. Some officers favored one method. Others preferred the second. The ordinary sailors noticed these subtle divisions. They remained respectful toward both men. Still, opinions slowly formed. Leadership during hardship revealed qualities impossible to measure in comfortable circumstances. Late one evening, after the camp had settled into silence, the sky unexpectedly cleared. Clouds drifted away, revealing countless stars overhead. For many weeks, heavy weather had hidden the night sky almost completely. Now the constellations appeared brilliantly above the dark mountains. Several sailors stepped quietly away from the fires simply to look upward. The familiar stars reminded them of home. They had guided generations of navigators across the oceans. Now they served another purpose. They reminded weary men that although the coastline remained strange, the heavens themselves had not changed. Captain Cheap also looked toward the stars. Navigation depended upon them whenever the weather allowed. Tomorrow, if the skies remained clear, the officers might finally obtain more accurate observations than they had managed in many weeks. Every reliable calculation improved their understanding of the coastline ahead. Every piece of certainty mattered. Before dawn, however, the clouds returned. Rain followed soon afterward. The brief glimpse of clear skies became another memory. Morning found the expedition preparing once again. Boats were loaded. Fires extinguished. Oars pushed against the water. The shoreline slipped slowly behind them. No one realized that the greatest dangers ahead would not emerge from hidden reefs or violent currents. They would arise from growing frustration, dwindling food, and increasingly different ideas about how desperate men should be led when survival itself hung in the balance. The farther the survivors traveled from the wreck site, the more demanding the journey became. The channels they followed rarely remained straight for long. One narrow passage opened into another, winding between steep, forested islands that seemed almost identical to one another. Dense clouds clung to the mountaintops, while cold rain drifted in from the Pacific with little warning. To the men in the boats, the landscape was beautiful. It was also exhausting. Every turn required fresh attention. Every unfamiliar headland demanded careful judgment. Navigation no longer depended simply upon rowing north. It required reading the coastline itself. Captain David Cheap and the officers compared their observations constantly with the charts they carried. The maps provided general guidance, but they could not describe every hidden rock or every swift current. Much of the coast had never been surveyed in detail by British navigators. The survivors were forced to trust experience as much as paper. Whenever uncertain water lay ahead, the lead line was lowered. A sailor standing near the bow called out the depth as the weighted line touched the seabed. 10 fathoms. 8. 6. The numbers mattered. A sudden decrease warned of shoals or submerged rocks. The boats slowed whenever the depth changed unexpectedly. No one wished to lose a vessel after surviving the wreck of HMS Voyage. Progress remained steady but slow. Some days they covered only a handful of miles. Strong tides often forced them to wait along the shore until the current changed direction. The delays frustrated everyone. Food continued disappearing. Time continued passing. Winter edged closer. The camps grew more temporary with each passing night. No one bothered improving shelters beyond what was absolutely necessary. Canvas was stretched between oars or driftwood. Small fires were lit beneath overhanging rocks whenever possible. The men slept in their damp clothing, knowing they would put it on again before dawn regardless. There was little point pretending otherwise. The surgeon noticed that exhaustion now affected even those who had seemed healthiest after the shipwreck. Hours of rowing strained shoulders and backs. Hands blistered repeatedly despite constant calluses. Cold seawater softened the skin until even gripping an oar became painful. Simple cuts healed slowly. The combination of fatigue, dampness, and limited food wore everyone down. One evening, while preparing camp beside a sheltered cove, several sailors managed to catch an unusually large number of fish. The meal that followed briefly lifted spirits. For the first time in days, conversations became livelier. Stories from earlier naval service returned. One man described crossing the Atlantic in calmer seasons. Another remembered merchant voyages through the Mediterranean. An older sailor spoke of the busy docks along the River Thames, where dozens of ships crowded the harbor at once. The memories reminded everyone that another world still existed beyond these isolated channels. A world of streets, markets, church bells, families. The wilderness around them seemed even quieter afterward. John Bulkeley continued earning respect among many of the crew through simple actions rather than speeches. He rowed alongside the sailors, helped pull boats ashore, shared the same food. When repairs were needed, he joined the work without hesitation. These gestures did not diminish Captain Cheap's authority, but they strengthened Bulkeley's reputation as a practical leader. Cheap himself remained fully committed to the expedition. He reviewed supplies every evening, studied the charts whenever weather allowed, maintained the discipline that had governed Royal Navy vessels for generations. From his perspective, structure remained essential. Without it, the expedition risked disorder. Without order, survival itself might become impossible. The differences between the two men still remained controlled, professional, respectful. Yet they became more visible as the hardships increased. One afternoon, the expedition encountered another obstacle. A broad channel ahead opened toward the Pacific, exposing the boats to heavier ocean swells. The waves were not enormous, but they rolled steadily into the passage, lifting and lowering the small craft in a slow, relentless rhythm. Spray washed over the bows. Water collected in the bottoms of the boats. The men took turns bailing while others continued rowing. Captain Cheap ordered the boats to stay close together. A separated boat could easily disappear behind the swells. Visibility shifted constantly as mist drifted across the water. For several anxious hours, the expedition moved cautiously through the exposed channel before finding the shelter of another island. When they finally landed, everyone was soaked. The fires took longer than usual to ignite. Dry wood had become increasingly difficult to find. Several men spent nearly an hour splitting larger logs before reaching timber dry enough to burn. When flames finally appeared, the relief was immediate. Warmth had become almost as valuable as food. That night, the weather deteriorated again. Wind swept through the trees. Rain struck the canvas shelters in steady waves. The boats, pulled well above the tide, creaked softly where they rested on the stones. Many sailors slept poorly. Some woke repeatedly, checking whether the wind had shifted. Others dreamed of home. The psychological burden of the journey had become as significant as the physical one. Every morning demanded another difficult decision to keep moving. No one knew exactly how much farther they had to travel. No one knew whether the next channel might finally lead them towards Spanish settlements, or merely deeper into the maze of islands. Even so, they continued, because stopping offered no future. As dawn slowly brightened the eastern sky, Captain Cheap walked along the shoreline inspecting the boats. John Bulkeley was already awake, examining the tide. The two officers exchanged a few quiet words before the camp fully stirred. Their conversation was calm, measured, professional. Yet beneath the surface, each carried a different vision of how this dangerous journey should proceed. Those differences had not yet broken the unity of the expedition. But every mile through the wilderness added another measure of strain. Soon, practical disagreements would begin turning into personal ones, and the remarkable cooperation that had carried the survivors this far would face its most difficult test since the day HMS Voyage was lost upon the rocks. The expedition had now spent many days moving through the labyrinth of islands. To the survivors, the landscape had become strangely familiar, even though every bay and every channel was new. Steep mountains still rose directly from the sea. Dense forests still covered nearly every hillside. Waterfalls appeared unexpectedly between the trees, their white streams tumbling into quiet coves before disappearing beneath the tide. The scenery remained beautiful. The journey remained relentless. Each morning, the boats were launched with the same careful routine. Each evening, they searched for another place to camp. Each day consumed more food. Each day demanded more strength. The rhythm of survival left little room for anything else. Captain David Cheap continued directing the expedition according to naval practice. Boats departed together. Signals passed from one crew to another. Stops were made only when necessary. The structure helped maintain order, but it also required patience from men whose energy was steadily fading. Some sailors now struggled to keep pace at the oars. Others silently traded places with exhausted companions before anyone had to ask. The strongest members of each crew gradually carried a greater share of the work. No one mentioned the imbalance. Everyone could see it. John Bulkeley observed the same pattern. Whenever an opportunity arose, he encouraged the crews to rotate more frequently at the oars, preserving strength over the course of the day rather than exhausting a few men early. It was a practical adjustment, and many sailors appreciated it. Captain Cheap did not object to such measures, yet he remained careful that any changes occurred within the existing chain of command. The distinction was subtle. Still, it reflected the different ways each officer approached leadership during hardship. The weather offered little consistency. A calm morning might become a cold afternoon filled with driving rain. Mist often settled so heavily over the channels that the lead boat disappeared from view, even though it lay only a short distance ahead. During such moments, voices replaced visual signals. Officers called across the water, or slowed. The boats drew closer together until visibility improved. More than once, the expedition paused entirely, unwilling to risk striking unseen rocks. Navigation demanded constant concentration. The coastline appeared confusing even in daylight. Without reliable landmarks, every bend looked remarkably similar to the last. The charts remained only rough guides. Many islands before them had never been accurately mapped by British surveyors. Captain Cheap relied upon experience, careful observation, and the occasional glimpse of the sun whenever the clouds parted long enough for a useful bearing. The survivors had become remarkably skilled at adapting. When fishing proved impossible because of rough seas, they searched the shoreline for shellfish. When heavy rain soaked their firewood, they split larger logs to reach the dry wood hidden inside. When an oar cracked against submerged rock, the carpenter repaired it using timber carried from the wreck of HMS Voyage. Nothing was wasted. Every object possessed value. One afternoon, the expedition encountered a broad inlet where the tide had retreated unusually far. Mudflats stretched across much of the shoreline. The boats could advance no farther until the water returned. The delay frustrated many of the sailors. Hours slipped away while they waited. Captain Cheap ordered the men to use the time productively. Some gathered shellfish. Others repaired clothing that had begun falling apart after weeks of exposure to saltwater and rain. The carpenter inspected every boat once again. Bulkeley walked along the shoreline studying the changing tide. Even moments of forced delay became opportunities for preparation. The surgeon also took advantage of the pause. He examined several men whose condition had noticeably worsened. Swollen joints, persistent coughs, deep fatigue. The signs of prolonged hardship had become impossible to ignore. A few sailors had grown so thin that their uniforms hung loosely from their shoulders. Yet they continued rowing whenever called upon. Determination often carried them farther than physical strength alone. That evening, after the tide finally returned and the boats reached another sheltered campsite, the atmosphere around the fires felt quieter than usual. Conversation had become increasingly practical. How much food remained? How far might they still have to travel? Would the next channel finally lead toward inhabited territory? Speculation replaced storytelling. The uncertainty weighed upon everyone. One older sailor quietly remarked that he no longer remembered the last completely dry day he had experienced. Several others smiled faintly. No one disagreed. Even sleep brought little relief. The damp ground, cold air, and constant vigilance prevented deep rest. Still, each dawn required another full day of labor. Captain Cheap continued recording observations whenever possible. Although his opportunities for precise navigation remained limited, he recognized the importance of maintaining a careful account of their progress. Officers of the Royal Navy were expected to keep journals, and those records might someday help explain the expedition's fate should they survive to reach Britain. Bulkeley also maintained notes from his own perspective. Neither man realized that these journals would later become central pieces of evidence when very different accounts of the same events reached England. For now, however, there was no courtroom, no public debate, only a group of weary survivors moving cautiously through one of the world's most isolated coastlines. As darkness settled over the camp, light rain began once again. The familiar sound tapped softly against stretched canvas. The boats rested just beyond the firelight, secured well above the tide. Tomorrow they would continue north. The channels ahead remained unknown. The weather remained uncertain. The food continued to diminish. And beneath the steady rhythm of rowing, camping, and survival, quiet differences in judgment were beginning to harden into convictions that would soon challenge the authority Captain Cheap believed essential, and the practical leadership many sailors increasingly looked for in John Bulkeley. By now, the survivors had been living in open boats for many weeks. The rhythm of the journey had become almost automatic. Wake before dawn. Rekindle the fire. Eat a carefully measured breakfast. Load the boats. Push away from shore. Row until the tide or the fading light forced another landing. Then begin the entire process again. No one needed to be reminded of the routine anymore. Their bodies remembered it. Their muscles remembered it. Even so, the physical cost continued to grow. Shoulders ached from endless rowing. Hands remained cracked from salt water. Faces had become deeply weathered by wind, rain, and cold. Many of the men scarcely resembled the sailors who had sailed from England aboard HMS Voyage more than a year earlier. The boats also showed signs of constant use. Despite the carpenter's careful work, every day introduced new problems. A loose fastening here, small leak there, an oar beginning to split, a sail needing another patch. Each evening brought another round of repairs. The expedition survived not because its equipment remained perfect, but because the men refused to let small problems become large ones. Captain David Cheap inspected the boats regularly. He understood that neglect could prove fatal. Every repair delayed another disaster. Every careful inspection reduced unnecessary risk. His attention to detail earned respect, even among sailors who sometimes questioned his decisions. No one doubted that he cared deeply about the survival of the expedition. The question was no longer whether Captain Cheap wanted to save them. The question was how that goal should be achieved. John Bulkeley remained equally active. He spent long hours speaking with the crews while they rowed, not delivering speeches, simply talking, asking about sore hands, checking whether anyone needed relief at the oars, discussing the next landing place. His calm manner reassured many of the ordinary sailors. Leadership, they increasingly felt, could also be quiet. One afternoon, the expedition entered another particularly narrow passage. The current rushed between steep rock walls with remarkable force. The lead boat slowed. The others followed carefully behind. The helmsman worked constantly to keep the bows pointed into the flow. A single mistake might drive a boat sideways against the rocks. The men rowed steadily. No sudden movements. No wasted effort. When the final boat finally emerged into calmer water, several sailors allowed themselves a brief smile. Another difficult obstacle had been overcome. The victories of this journey were rarely dramatic. More often, they consisted simply of reaching the next campsite safely. Late that day, the weather shifted once again. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains. A strong wind descended through the valleys, striking the boats from the side. The calm water quickly changed. Small waves became larger. Spray swept across the gunwales. The officers immediately ordered the crews closer together. Voices carried across the water as each boat adjusted its course. Rain followed within minutes. Visibility shrank. The shoreline nearly disappeared behind gray mist. Captain Cheap made the decision to abandon further progress for the day. The nearest sheltered beach became their destination. Landing in such conditions demanded great care. Several sailors jumped into the freezing water to steady the boats while others unloaded the supplies. Food barrels were carried above the tide line first, then the water casks, finally the remaining equipment. Only after everything essential had been secured did the men begin building shelters. By then, every person in the expedition was soaked. Lighting fires became an exercise in patience. Dry tinder had been protected carefully inside waterproof containers fashioned from waxed canvas. Even so, several attempts failed before flames finally appeared. When they did, the men gathered around silently. Warmth seemed almost miraculous after hours in the cold rain. The evening meal consisted of a small ration of biscuit and fish caught earlier in the day. No one complained about the simplicity. The expedition had long since abandoned expectations of comfort. The surgeon used the quiet evening to examine several sailors whose health had noticeably declined. One man's swollen legs worried him. Another suffered persistent bleeding gums. A third struggled with a fever that had lingered for several days. The surgeon possessed skill and experience, but 18th century medicine offered limited remedies. Clean water, warmth, rest, fresh food whenever available. Beyond those measures, nature often decided the outcome. Captain Cheap listened carefully to the surgeon's report. The news strengthened his concern. The expedition needed to reach inhabited territory before more men became too weak to continue. Yet reaching that territory still required careful navigation through dangerous waters. Speed without caution could destroy them. Caution without progress might do the same. The dilemma remained unchanged. Around the fires that night, conversation turned quietly toward the Spanish settlements believed to lie farther north. Some sailors wondered how they would be received. Would local governors treat British naval officers according to the accepted customs of war? Would ordinary seamen receive the same consideration? No one knew. Few among them had ever visited the Pacific coast of South America before this voyage. Everything ahead remained uncertain. John Bulkeley listened without offering false reassurance. He understood as well as anyone that survival depended first upon reaching those settlements. Questions about captivity could wait until then. As darkness settled completely across the camp, rain finally eased. The wind gradually weakened. Beyond the narrow beach, the boats rested securely beside one another. Their patched hulls reflected the glow of the dying fires. They had carried the survivors through another difficult day. Tomorrow they would do so again. But beneath the steady routine, Another current continued gathering strength. The hardships of the voyage were no longer affecting only tired muscles and empty stomachs. They were beginning to shape loyalties. Some men looked first to Captain Cheap whenever uncertainty arose. Others increasingly turned toward John Bulkeley. The difference remained quiet, respectful, almost invisible. Yet with every passing mile through the lonely channels of Patagonia, those separate loyalties were slowly preparing the ground for the bitter dispute that would soon divide the survivors of HMS Voyager into opposing camps. The farther north the expedition traveled, the more obvious it became that survival depended as much upon judgment as endurance. The men had already proven that they could withstand hunger. They had survived storms powerful enough to destroy a Royal Navy warship. They had lived for weeks on a remote island with only the wreck of HMS Voyager to sustain them. Now they faced a different challenge. Every decision carried consequences that could not easily be reversed. A wrong channel might cost several days. A poorly chosen campsite might leave them exposed to dangerous tides. A mistake in rationing could become impossible to correct. The burden of command grew heavier with every mile. Captain David Cheap felt that weight constantly. Each morning he reviewed the route ahead with his officers before the boats entered the water. Whenever possible, he compared the visible coastline with the imperfect charts they carried. The maps still offered only broad outlines. Individual islands appeared where none had been marked. Some passages shown on paper proved much narrower than expected. Others simply did not exist. Navigation became an exercise in observation rather than certainty. John Bulkeley also studied the coastline closely. His years at sea had taught him to notice subtle signs. The direction of floating kelp, the color of the water over hidden rocks, the movement of seabirds that often indicated sheltered bays beyond the next headland. His practical knowledge frequently complemented the captain's formal navigation. The two men still cooperated, yet their conversations had become noticeably shorter. Neither wished to waste energy arguing. Even so, their different approaches increasingly shaped the expedition. The weather refused to settle. One morning began beneath clear skies. The men welcomed the rare sunshine. Blankets dried while the boats moved steadily through calm channels. For several hours the journey felt almost peaceful. The surrounding mountains reflected perfectly upon the water. Snow remained visible on distant peaks. The silence of the wilderness seemed complete except for the steady splash of oars. Then, shortly after midday, the sky darkened. Clouds poured over the mountains as though spilling across invisible walls. A cold wind swept down the valleys. Within minutes the calm water transformed. Small whitecaps appeared. Rain followed almost immediately. The change happened so quickly that several sailors later remarked it seemed as though two different seasons had arrived in the same afternoon. The officers reacted without hesitation. The boats altered course toward the nearest protected shoreline. Rowers increased their effort despite growing fatigue. The wind struck directly against them now. Progress slowed dramatically. Several waves broke across the bows, forcing men to bail continuously while others continued rowing. At last the expedition reached a narrow cove shielded by high cliffs. Landing there required careful timing between incoming waves. One by one the boats reached the shore safely. Only after the final craft had been secured did the men allow themselves a moment to rest. Everyone was exhausted. The storm continued through much of the afternoon. Unable to travel farther, the survivors focused on repairing equipment once again. Wet clothing was hung wherever the fires provided enough warmth. Damaged rope was spliced. Sails received fresh patches. The carpenter replaced a cracked rowing thwart using timber carried from the wreck months earlier. The boats remained functional because constant maintenance never stopped. The surgeon spent much of the afternoon treating blistered hands. Nearly every sailor now suffered from them. Repeated exposure to salt water prevented proper healing. Bandages helped only briefly before becoming soaked again. Even so, every small treatment eased another day of rowing. As evening approached, the rain weakened. Captain Cheap walked along the shoreline, observing the boats resting above the tide. He knew they had accomplished something extraordinary already. Very few shipwreck survivors had ever navigated this coastline in such small craft. Yet he also understood that the most difficult section of the journey might still lie ahead. Food stores had become dangerously low. Fresh catches from fishing parties varied greatly. Some evenings provided enough fish for everyone. Others produced almost nothing. The uncertainty forced increasingly strict rationing. The sailors accepted the smaller portions without open complaint. Still, hunger affected patience. Tired men grew quieter. Minor frustrations lingered longer than before. John Bulkeley noticed the same changes. He continued speaking calmly with the crews during the evenings, encouraging them to conserve strength and remain focused upon the next day's work rather than the uncertain distance still ahead. His practical optimism appealed to many. Captain Cheap remained more reserved. He believed confidence should come from discipline rather than reassurance. Neither philosophy was inherently wrong. Each reflected years of different experience. The officers themselves still maintained outward respect. Yet the ordinary sailors had begun recognizing the contrast. One group naturally looked toward the captain for formal direction. Another increasingly admired Bulkeley's direct, practical manner. The difference remained subtle. No orders had been disobeyed. No authority openly challenged. But loyalties often begin shifting long before conflict becomes visible. That night, after the fires had burned low, several officers quietly reviewed the remaining provisions. The calculations were sobering. Even under reduced rations, the preserved stores would not last indefinitely. Fresh food would become increasingly important. So would progress. Every unnecessary delay now carried greater risk than before. When dawn returned, the storm had passed. A light mist floated across the water, softening the outlines of the surrounding islands. The boats were launched once more. Oars dipped into the calm surface. The expedition continued north. Behind them stretched countless miles of wilderness already crossed. Ahead remained many more. The survivors had escaped the wreck. They had escaped starvation on the island. Now they were approaching the point where the greatest danger would no longer come from the sea alone. The relentless pressure of hunger, exhaustion, and uncertain leadership was slowly pushing the expedition toward decisions that would alter not only their chances of survival, but also the reputations of Captain David Cheap and John Bulkeley for generations to come. Several more days passed before the character of the journey began to change. The survivors still launched their boats each morning before first light. They still searched every evening for a sheltered beach where they could haul the craft above the tide. The routine itself remained familiar. What changed was the condition of the men. Weeks of rowing through the cold channels had steadily drained their strength. Even the healthiest sailors now showed signs of fatigue. Shoulders stiffened before the first hour of rowing had ended. Hands wrapped in worn bandages struggled to grip the oars. Some men rose slowly after each landing, their legs protesting after long hours confined inside the narrow boats. The surgeon could do little beyond encouraging rest whenever possible. Rest, however, had become a luxury. Progress demanded movement. Captain David Cheap noticed the slower pace immediately. He ordered more frequent pauses during difficult stretches of water, allowing exhausted crews a few moments to recover before tackling strong currents. The decision reflected practical necessity rather than comfort. An exhausted rower could not safely maneuver a heavily loaded boat through narrow channels. John Bulkeley supported the adjustment. He had long argued that preserving strength over many weeks mattered more than forcing a faster pace on any single day. For the moment, both officers agreed. The expedition benefited from their cooperation. The coastline itself remained as challenging as ever. Some passages narrowed so sharply that the boats traveled almost beneath overhanging branches. Elsewhere, broad stretches of open water exposed them once again to Pacific swells rolling in from beyond the outer islands. Each change demanded different skills. Rowing close to hidden rocks required patience. Crossing open water demanded courage. The weather never allowed complacency. One afternoon, thick fog descended so rapidly that the lead boat disappeared almost entirely from sight. The officers immediately reduced speed. Voices echoed across the mist. The crews answered one another to maintain contact. No one wished to become separated. Within the dense fog, sound traveled farther than vision. The steady splash of synchronized oars became strangely reassuring. Only after nearly 2 hours did the mist begin lifting, revealing the surrounding islands once more. Everyone felt relief. Losing a single boat in such conditions could have proved disastrous. That evening, the expedition found shelter beside a small freshwater stream flowing through a narrow valley. The location offered excellent drinking water and enough driftwood to build several strong fires. For the first time in many days, some clothing dried completely. The simple comfort noticeably improved morale. Several sailors even managed quiet laughter while preparing the evening meal. Fresh fish supplemented the increasingly limited preserved rations. It was not a feast. Yet it reminded everyone that the sea still provided opportunities alongside its dangers. Captain Cheap gathered his officers after supper. Their discussions centered upon navigation. Based on their observations, they believed they had made meaningful progress northward. Still, the exact distance remained uncertain. The incomplete charts prevented absolute confidence. Every estimate contained room for error. The officers compared bearings, coastal features, and tidal observations. John Bulkeley contributed his own practical assessments gathered during the journey. Although opinions occasionally differed regarding precise locations, the discussions remained respectful. Each officer understood that accurate navigation served everyone equally. Nearby, ordinary sailors rested beside the fading fires. Conversation drifted toward the future. Some wondered how much farther the Spanish settlements might lie. Others imagined what fresh bread or warm beds would feel like after so many months. A few even spoke quietly about returning to England. Those conversations reflected hope more than certainty. No one could yet know whether they would reach civilization safely. The surgeon continued keeping careful notes. He observed that fresh fish and shellfish had slowed the worsening effects of scurvy for some men, though they had not eliminated the disease. Several sailors remained dangerously weak. Others had improved slightly compared with their condition on the island. The differences reminded him how unpredictable survival could be. Small advantages often determined who endured and who did not. As darkness settled across the valley, rain threatened once again but never fully arrived. Clouds drifted overhead without releasing more than a light drizzle. The stars briefly appeared through a break in the sky. Several experienced navigators quietly looked upward. Even a short glimpse allowed them to confirm certain bearings before the clouds closed again. Every observation mattered. Captain Cheap retired later than most. He spent additional time reviewing his journal by the light of a lantern carefully shielded from the wind. He understood that these records might someday be examined by the Admiralty. Every order, every decision, every challenge. An officer's journal formed part of his duty. Unknown to him, John Bulkeley also continued maintaining detailed notes of the expedition. His perspective naturally differed. He focused more upon practical hardships, daily conditions, and the decisions affecting the ordinary sailors. Neither man intended to create conflicting histories. They simply recorded events through different responsibilities. Those journals would later become some of the most important surviving accounts of the Voyage disaster. For now, however, history remained unwritten. The boats still floated together. The officers still worked side by side. The expedition still moved north as one body. Yet beneath the outward unity, quiet differences in judgment continued to deepen. The hardships of the voyage had not yet broken their cooperation. But every passing day added another layer of fatigue, another reduction in food, and another difficult decision. Soon circumstances would force those differences into the open, transforming careful disagreements over navigation and survival into a conflict that would ultimately reshape the fate of the survivors and become the central controversy remembered in the remarkable story of HMS Voyage. The expedition pressed onward with the quiet determination that had carried it through every hardship since the loss of HMS Voyage. No one spoke much during the mornings anymore. The familiar sounds of the day had replaced conversation. The splash of oars entering cold water, the creak of damp timber under strain, the steady breathing of tired men working together, the distant cries of seabirds drifting across the channels. These sounds became the rhythm of their world. Every mile north represented another small victory, yet every mile also consumed more strength than the last. The coastline gradually began to change. The towering mountains remained, but the channels occasionally widened into broad inlets where the wind gathered enough space to build larger waves. Crossing these exposed waters demanded careful timing. Captain David Cheap insisted upon waiting whenever conditions appeared uncertain. More than once, the expedition remained ashore for several hours while officers studied the weather and the movement of the tides. To impatient sailors, such delays felt costly. To experienced seamen, they often prevented disaster. John Bulkeley rarely disagreed with caution where the sea itself was concerned. He understood as well as anyone how quickly an open boat could be overwhelmed by rough water. His greater concern remained the dwindling provisions. Every delay consumed another day's food. The balance between safety and urgency had become increasingly difficult to maintain. One afternoon the expedition encountered a stretch of coastline unlike anything they had yet crossed. Steep granite cliffs rose almost directly from the sea. There was no beach, no sheltered cove, no obvious place where the boats could land if the weather suddenly changed. The officers studied the shoreline carefully. Continuing meant several hours without refuge. Turning back offered no advantage. Captain Cheap chose to proceed. The boats entered the passage in close formation. The sea remained calm enough at first. Long swells rolled beneath the hulls without breaking. The cliffs echoed every sound. The rhythmic splash of oars seemed louder than usual. Even quiet voices carried surprisingly far across the water. Halfway through the passage, a fresh wind descended from the mountains. It was not a violent storm, but it arrived suddenly. The swells steepened. Spray began washing over the bows. The helmsman concentrated intensely. There could be no mistakes. With cliffs on one side and open water on the other, the boats had little room to maneuver. The men rowed steadily, not frantically. Years of seamanship had taught them that panic wasted energy. Discipline preserved it. After several tense hours, the coastline finally opened once more. A small gravel beach appeared ahead, protected by a narrow headland. The expedition landed there before the weather worsened further. As soon as the boats reached shore, everyone moved quickly. Supplies were carried above the tide line. The boats were secured with extra ropes against the strengthening wind. Fires proved difficult to light, but eventually dry wood hidden inside larger logs produced enough flame to warm the exhausted crews. That evening, while the rain tapped gently against stretched canvas, Captain Cheap assembled the officers. The discussion centered on supplies. The figures were becoming increasingly alarming. Preserved food remained, but not in abundance. Fresh fish continued supplementing their diet whenever possible, yet poor weather often prevented successful fishing. The margin for delay had become very small. John Bulkeley acknowledged the captain's concerns. He suggested that every favorable weather window should be used to make as much progress as possible. Cheap agreed in principle. At the same time, he refused to risk the entire expedition by forcing dangerous passages under poor conditions. The conversation remained respectful. Neither officer questioned the other's commitment. Still, their priorities had become easier to distinguish. Some officers naturally leaned toward the captain's cautious discipline. Others quietly found Bulkeley's practical urgency persuasive. The ordinary sailors noticed these differences, even if few understood the discussions themselves. Around the campfires, opinions formed quietly. No one spoke of division. No one imagined mutiny. The expedition still functioned under Captain Cheap's command. Yet hardship has a way of encouraging men to measure leaders not only by rank, but also by results. The surgeon spent part of the evening tending to several sailors whose hands had become badly infected after weeks of rowing in cold salt water. Simple blisters had opened repeatedly. Without proper opportunity to heal, they became painful wounds. Bandages were changed. The limited supply of medicinal ointments was used sparingly. The surgeon understood that every treatment consumed resources that could not easily be replaced. Sleep came slowly that night. The wind continued sweeping through the trees. Several sailors woke repeatedly to check that the boats remained secure above the rising tide. Losing even one craft would place the entire expedition in immediate danger. Before dawn, the weather finally eased. Clouds drifted apart just enough for the eastern sky to brighten. The fires were stirred back to life. Breakfast was prepared in silence. Captain Cheap inspected every boat personally before giving the order to launch. John Bulkeley moved among the crews, ensuring loads remained balanced after the previous evening's unloading. Within an hour, the boats were once again moving north through the quiet channels. Behind them lay countless campsites now abandoned to the wilderness. Ahead remained an uncertain future. The survivors had endured shipwreck, isolation, disease, and one of the harshest coastlines on Earth. They continued as a single expedition. But the constant pressure of hunger, exhaustion, and difficult decisions was steadily eroding the fragile harmony that had carried them this far. Very soon, that pressure would force disagreements into the open, beginning the chain of events that would lead to open conflict, accusations of mutiny, and one of the most controversial court-martial cases in the history of the Royal Navy. The expedition entered another week of travel with fewer provisions than at any point since leaving the island where HMS Wager had broken apart. The careful calculations made each evening had become impossible to ignore. Every remaining barrel represented only a handful of meals. Every successful fishing stop delayed hunger for another day. Every unsuccessful one forced another reduction in rations. The arithmetic of survival had become relentless. Captain David Cheap gathered his officers before sunrise. Their breakfast had been brief. A small portion of biscuit. Whatever fish remained from the previous evening. Fresh water collected from the nearby stream. No one lingered around the fire. The discussion ahead demanded their full attention. The charts were spread across an overturned barrel. Cheap reviewed the estimated distance still separating them from the nearest Spanish settlements. No precise figure could be given. The coastline remained too imperfectly mapped. Cloudy weather had prevented accurate celestial observations on many nights. Even experienced navigators could only estimate their progress. John Bulkeley listened carefully. When the captain finished, he quietly pointed toward the sea. The weather looked favorable. The tide would soon begin flowing northward. If they intended to make good distance that day, they needed to launch quickly. Cheap agreed. Within the hour, the boats once again entered the cold water. The morning passed without incident. Low clouds drifted across the mountains. A light breeze pushed gently from the southwest. The men settled into the familiar rhythm of rowing. Let go. Recover. Let go. Recover. The steady movement almost resembled breathing. Hours passed that way. No one wasted energy speaking unless necessary. The surrounding wilderness remained magnificent. Dark forests climbed steep hillsides. Snow lingered upon distant mountain peaks. Sea eagles circled silently overhead. Occasionally, seals surfaced beside the boats, watching the strange visitors before disappearing beneath the gray water. It was a landscape largely untouched by European settlement. To the exhausted sailors, however, beauty had become secondary. What they searched for now were signs of people. Smoke rising from distant shores. Fishing boats. Fields. Anything suggesting civilization lay ahead. Nothing appeared. Late in the afternoon, the expedition encountered another difficult tidal passage. The current surged through a narrow gap between two rocky islands. Foaming water twisted across the channel. Captain Cheap ordered the boats to wait until the tide slackened. Some sailors exchanged weary glances. Waiting consumed valuable daylight. Yet everyone understood the danger. Attempting the passage too early could sweep a heavily loaded boat against the rocks. The delay lasted nearly 2 hours. During that time, several men gathered shellfish while others repaired equipment. The carpenter tightened loose fastenings on one of the boats. The surgeon changed damp bandages covering blistered hands. Bulkeley walked quietly along the shoreline, observing the changing current. When the tide finally weakened, the expedition crossed safely. No cheers followed, only quiet relief. The day ended at another temporary campsite sheltered beneath tall trees. The routine unfolded almost automatically. Boats ashore, supplies unloaded, firewood collected, water fetched, fish cleaned, supper prepared. It had become a practiced sequence requiring remarkably little conversation. After the meal, Captain Cheap called another meeting with the officers. The atmosphere differed from earlier gatherings. Not hostile, more serious. Food remained the central concern. The reduced rations had preserved supplies longer than expected, but the men were visibly weaker. Several sailors had lost considerable weight. The surgeon confirmed that prolonged undernourishment was affecting even those previously considered healthy. Fresh fish helped whenever available. It could not entirely replace the dwindling stores. Bulkeley proposed maximizing travel during every favorable tide, arguing that reaching inhabited territory quickly now mattered more than preserving energy through frequent delays. Captain Cheap agreed that progress remained essential, yet he refused to compromise safety. The boats carried every surviving member of the expedition. One reckless decision might destroy everything they had endured. The discussion remained measured, professional. Still, each conversation now revealed the same underlying difference. Bulkeley viewed time as the greatest enemy. Cheap viewed unnecessary risk as the greater danger. Neither position lacked logic. The officers listening around the fire understood both arguments. The ordinary sailors, though not present, sensed the growing tension through small changes. Conversations among the officers lasted longer. Expressions appeared more thoughtful. Orders became more deliberate. No one openly questioned Captain Cheap's authority. Not yet. But many sailors increasingly looked toward Bulkeley for practical reassurance during the day's work. Leadership existed in more than one form. That evening, after the meetings ended, several men sat quietly beside the fading fire. One sailor spoke softly about hearing church bells in England before dawn. Another remembered the smell of freshly baked bread from a village market. A third admitted he could barely remember the sound of busy streets after so many months surrounded only by wind and water. No one laughed. The memories seemed almost unreal now. The wilderness had become their entire world. Captain Cheap remained awake after most of the camp had fallen asleep. By lantern light, he carefully entered another day's observations into his journal. Weather, distance, supplies, decisions. He knew these records might someday explain the fate of HMS Voyage to the Admiralty. Not far away, John Bulkeley also wrote in his own notebook. His entries reflected the same events viewed through different responsibilities. Neither man intended to create competing histories. Yet history would later depend heavily upon both accounts. Before dawn, rain began falling once again, soft at first, then steadily. The familiar sound echoed across the quiet camp. The boats rested securely beside the shore, their patched hulls glistening beneath the rain. Tomorrow they would continue north once more. Unknown to the weary survivors, they were approaching the stage of their journey where physical hardship would increasingly give way to human conflict, and where decisions made under impossible circumstances would later be judged not only by those who lived through them, but also by a Royal Navy court-martial thousands of miles away in Britain. The rain continued through much of the night, falling with the slow, steady rhythm that had become so familiar to the survivors. By dawn, the fires had nearly burned themselves out. Ash covered the damp wood. The canvas shelters sagged beneath collected water. Every blanket felt heavy with moisture. No one expected comfort anymore. The men simply rose, shook the rain from their coats, and began another day. Breakfast was smaller than it had been only a week earlier. Captain David Cheap had ordered another careful reduction in the remaining preserved provisions. No one protested. The shrinking food stores spoke for themselves. Each sailor accepted his portion in silence. Fresh water from the nearby stream helped ease the hunger for a short while, but only for a short while. Soon enough, the familiar emptiness returned. The boats were loaded with practiced efficiency. Every barrel returned to its assigned place. Water casks were secured. The few remaining medical supplies were packed carefully inside waterproof coverings. Spare sails, ropes, axes, muskets, and navigation instruments were checked one final time before departure. Nothing could be forgotten. Replacing anything lost was nearly impossible. Captain Cheap stood near the water's edge watching the launch. One by one, the boats slipped back into the channel. The tide favored them that morning. The current flowed steadily northward, allowing the crews to conserve valuable strength. Even so, every man still pulled his oar. The expedition had learned that nature offered assistance only to those already working. The morning passed beneath low clouds. Mist drifted between the islands, sometimes revealing distant mountains before swallowing them once again. The scenery possessed an almost timeless quality. Towering forests reached down to the shoreline. Waterfalls spilled from unseen valleys high above. The only signs of human presence were the small boats moving quietly through the vast wilderness. The survivors had become remarkably skilled navigators of this difficult coast. Each helmsman watched the color of the water carefully. Dark patches often indicated greater depth. Lighter shades sometimes revealed hidden rocks beneath the surface. The lead line continued to be used whenever uncertainty arose. Experience had become their greatest chart. Late in the morning, the expedition encountered a strong cross-current entering from a narrow side channel. The unexpected flow pushed the leading boat toward a rocky point. Its crew reacted immediately. Several men pulled harder on one side while the helmsman corrected the course. The boat cleared the rocks safely, though only by a narrow margin. The other boats adjusted their own approach after watching the maneuver. Another danger had been avoided. No one celebrated. Safe passage had become an expectation rather than an achievement. Still, every successful decision carried the expedition one step closer to survival. By midday the wind strengthened. Not enough to force them ashore. Enough to slow their progress. The boats continued steadily forward, their patched sails providing only occasional assistance. Most of the work still belonged to the oars. Hours passed. The coastline unfolded one headland after another. Every distant point raised the same quiet hope. Perhaps beyond this one. Perhaps beyond the next. Yet each new channel revealed only more wilderness. No villages appeared. No fishing boats. No smoke rising from settled communities. The Spanish frontier remained somewhere ahead, but exactly where remained uncertain. During a brief stop to collect fresh water, the surgeon examined several sailors whose conditions had steadily worsened. One man's swollen gums made chewing nearly impossible. Another suffered persistent pain in his joints. Several carried infected blisters despite repeated treatment. The surgeon spoke privately with Captain Cheap afterward. His assessment was simple. The expedition still possessed enough determined men to continue, but they could not afford many more weeks of such conditions. The captain understood. The pressure to reach civilization was becoming greater every day. John Bulkeley understood it equally well. As the boats resumed their journey, he quietly encouraged the rowers to maintain a smooth, consistent pace. He reminded them that exhausting themselves during one afternoon would only reduce tomorrow's progress. The sailors appreciated the advice. Their strength had become something to be guarded carefully. That evening, they reached another sheltered cove protected from the worst of the wind. The routine repeated itself once more. Boats ashore, supplies unloaded, firewood gathered, fires lit. A modest supper prepared from fish caught near the shoreline and carefully rationed biscuit. Around the campfires, conversation remained subdued. Most men were too tired for long stories. Instead, they spoke quietly about practical matters. The weather, tomorrow's tide, the condition of the boats, the remaining food. Hope now expressed itself through ordinary discussions rather than grand dreams. After the meal, Captain Cheap called together his senior officers. The meeting lasted longer than usual. Their maps suggested they should be drawing closer to regions occasionally visited by Spanish patrols or indigenous canoe routes. Yet certainty remained impossible. The coast continued unfolding differently than expected. Every day revealed another island, another inlet, another difficult passage. The officers carefully considered every possibility before agreeing upon the next day's intended route. The discussion remained calm, professional, but the underlying tension had become unmistakable. Captain Cheap remained determined that discipline and careful judgment would see them safely through. John Bulkeley remained equally convinced that steady progress without unnecessary delay offered the best chance of survival. Neither questioned the courage of the other. Neither imagined abandoning the expedition. Yet the strain of many weeks in open boats had sharpened every disagreement. The ordinary sailors sensed it as well. No open arguments disturbed the camp. No order had been refused. Still, men increasingly found themselves comparing different styles of leadership, while quietly wondering which path would ultimately carry them home. As darkness settled over the cove, the fires slowly burned lower. Beyond their fading light, the boats rested side by side upon the stones, still carrying the hopes of every survivor. Within the coming stages of the journey, those hopes would face their greatest trial, not from hidden reefs or violent Pacific storms, but from the difficult choices that would divide the expedition, bring accusations of mutiny against members of the crew, and eventually place the surviving officers before a Royal Navy court-martial to defend every decision they had made since the day HMS Voyage was lost. Morning arrived beneath a sky of broken clouds. For the first time in many days, sunlight reached the narrow shoreline before disappearing once more behind drifting mist. The survivors rose as they always had. They rekindled the fires. They packed the boats. They checked the ropes. They counted the remaining provisions. Routine had become the quiet thread holding everything together. Yet the journey had reached a turning point. By this stage, the exhausted survivors were drawing nearer to inhabited parts of the Chilean coast. The isolation that had surrounded them since the wreck would not last forever. Before long, the group's shared struggle for survival would give way to questions of authority, responsibility, and accountability that no amount of courage at sea could resolve. What followed after these weeks of rowing through Patagonia became one of the most remarkable and controversial chapters in 18th-century naval history. The unity that had carried the survivors away from Wager Island did not survive intact. Captain David Cheap and John Bulkeley ultimately found themselves leading different groups of survivors after profound disagreements over command, survival, and the best route to safety. Those disagreements emerged gradually under extraordinary pressure, rather than from a single dramatic moment. Hunger, exhaustion, uncertainty, and the harsh realities of the Patagonian wilderness shaped every decision. Bulkeley and the men who accompanied him continued their long voyage north in the repaired boats. After enduring immense hardship along the coast, they eventually reached Portuguese Brazil. From there, Bulkeley found passage across the Atlantic and finally returned to Britain. Captain Cheap's path proved very different. He remained with a smaller party that continued north by another route. Their ordeal lasted many more months. They endured severe shortages of food, relied at times upon assistance from indigenous communities familiar with the region, and eventually reached Spanish colonial settlements in southern Chile. Because Britain and Spain were at war during the War of Jenkins' Ear, the British survivors became prisoners of the Spanish authorities. Even captivity, however, offered something the wilderness no longer could: shelter, food, medical attention, a chance to recover. The Spanish officers generally treated the surviving British naval personnel according to the accepted customs extended to prisoners of war. Their captivity was certainly not freedom, but after surviving shipwreck, starvation, and months among the remote channels of Patagonia, it also represented safety. Years passed before Captain Cheap finally returned to Britain. By then, the story of HMS Voyage had already begun spreading across the country. John Bulkeley had published his account. Other survivors shared their own memories. The public quickly became fascinated. How could one shipwreck produce such different versions of the same events? Who had acted properly? Who had failed in their duty? The Admiralty faced difficult questions. Royal Navy regulations required answers. A court-martial eventually examined the conduct of the surviving officers. Such proceedings were standard after the loss of a Royal Navy warship. The purpose was not merely to assign blame. It was to establish the facts surrounding the loss of the vessel, and to determine whether officers had fulfilled their responsibilities under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Captain David Cheap defended his actions. He argued that he had maintained lawful naval authority throughout the ordeal, and had acted according to his duty as commanding officer. John Bulkeley's published journal presented a different perspective, emphasizing practical survival and describing the hardships that had shaped the men's decisions after the wreck. Both accounts contained valuable observations. Both reflected genuine experiences. Both were influenced by the responsibilities and viewpoints of the men who wrote them. Modern historians continue comparing these narratives carefully. Neither journal alone tells the complete story. Together, however, they provide one of the richest first-hand records of survival ever preserved from the age of sail. The fate of HMS Voyage also influenced naval thinking for generations. The disaster highlighted the enormous challenges of rounding Cape Horn during the 18th century. It demonstrated the limitations of contemporary charts. It revealed how quickly discipline aboard a warship could be tested once that ship no longer existed. Perhaps most importantly, it reminded future naval officers that leadership involved more than issuing orders. Leadership required judgment under impossible circumstances, where every available choice carried genuine danger. Today, the wreck of HMS Voyage remains an important archaeological site off the coast of Chile. Artifacts recovered from the wreck continue helping historians understand the daily lives of 18th-century Royal Navy sailors. The journals written by Captain Cheap, John Bulkeley, Midshipman John Byron, who later became an admiral and the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron, and other survivors remain among the most valuable historical sources describing the disaster. Their words allow us to follow the voyage not through legend, but through the observations of those who endured it themselves. Nearly 3 centuries have passed since HMS Voyage struck the rocks in May 1741. The forests of Voyage Island still stand. The tides still race through the same narrow channels. The Pacific Ocean still rolls against those remote shores with the same relentless power that overwhelmed a British warship so long ago. Nature has changed very little. It is the human story that continues to captivate us. Not simply because of the shipwreck. Not simply because of the mutiny or the court-martial. But because ordinary people, placed in extraordinary circumstances, revealed both the remarkable strength and the difficult complexity of human survival. As this quiet journey through history comes to a close, perhaps you can picture those cold channels one last time. Imagine the small wooden boats resting beside a lonely Patagonian shore. The campfires glowing softly beneath ancient trees. The sound of gentle waves touching the pebbled beach. The distant cry of seabirds fading into the evening mist. Take one slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. Allow the noise of the modern world to drift away, just as the tide slowly carries the water through those quiet southern channels. And as the last embers of the campfire fade into the night, you can gently close your eyes, knowing that one of history's most extraordinary true stories has finally found its peaceful ending.